Colleagues, I'd like to call the 16th meeting of the Strategic Priorities and Policy Committee, and in so doing, make the following announcement, that the City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats and communication supports for council, standing or advisory committee meetings, and information upon request. And to make any request for a city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or by dialing 519-661-2489, extension 2425. As needed, the intention for the committee is to recess approximately 6:30 for nibblies as required. And before I ask for disclosures of pecuniary interest, I'd like to welcome Deputy Mayor Helmer back from a well-deserved honeymoon and breakaway. And when I asked him yesterday during the Pride Parade, of all the travels, what's his favorite country? Now, this is a bit smarmy. He says Canada, you know. He spends a month away and says Canada. Well, welcome back, Deputy Mayor. It's great to have you here. I'll look for disclosures of pecuniary interest, please. Councillor Turner.
Your Worship, in item 4.1, review of city services for potential reductions and eliminations, nothing's been raised at this time, but I would just raise as a kind of, should it come up, I would declare a conflict of anything regarding the Middlesex London Health Unit as my employer, or anything with respect to any of the transfers that might be associated with the early on funding administered by the city, as my wife is an employee of ChildReach, which receives early on funding.
Thank you. So noted. Any other declarations? Seeing none, I see nothing on the consent agenda. Scheduled items. Can we do this, please, colleagues? Under items for direction, we have, as you know, under review of city services, a fairly involved component for which Councillor Morgan will be taking the lead. But we've got some items here, 4.2, 4.3, and 5.1 before confidential session, and it would be my ask of you, if there are no objections, to immediately go to 4.2, 4.3, 5.1, and then return back to 4.1 as appropriate. I don't know, do I need a motion, clerk, for that? No. Is there any objections to that? Because I'm allowed to do this by asking. Okay. Then we'll turn your attention to the screen since we're not voting. We will now go to old habits. See, it's been a couple of weeks. 4.2, we have the resignation of Councillor Steve Hillier from the London Convention Centre. You will see his communication on page 254 of the report. And I'm guided by that we are in a position, if we wish, to be able to seek a member from council to replace the irreplaceable Steve Hillier. If there's someone that'd like to have their name put forward, could they so indicate? Councillor Turner?
Your Worship, I'd be interested in seeking that appointment. One, because I share a name with the guy who's leaving, and two, because I currently sit on no boards or commissions. I was unable to obtain one during our appointments process, so I think this would be a good opportunity, and it's one that I do have interest in.
And is there anyone else interested? Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, I'd like to, in the interest of having another person named Steve also at council, I'd like to put forward Councillor Lehman's name for this position. I know that he's expressed some interest in it to me, and I'm sure that he would do a good job in that role, so I'd like to put his name forward.
All right, so see, what makes it easier for the convention center is Steve being replaced by Steve or Steve. It sounds like interesting. Yeah. Any other individuals who may well be interested to be considered for this esteemed position? So we have two individuals that have indicated their interest in that. I think we need a motion to have their names put forward formally. I think that's the process, clerk. Does that make sense?
You need a seconder, maybe one or both.
Okay. Then I think if we've got Stephen Turner, sorry, we'll just stay with Steve, nominated, and that's his motion, and we've got a motion by Sean Lewis. Is there a seconder for those motions? Councillor Hillier, for both. That makes it easy. Steve and Steve, seconded by Steve. That makes a lot of sense.
To deal with one motion.
Pardon me?
To deal with one motion. Unless you're doing one motion.
So we have one motion with both names on it. I think that'll just make that more compelling. So the clerks are chatting. Councillor Lehman?
Just to give equal floor time to my esteemed colleague to put forth my cause.
No, we'll get there. We'll get there. We have two names moved and a secondary. We're going to vote on that, and then we will have an election, it would appear. Okay. All right? So just from one Steve to another, just be patient, please.
Closing the vote, that motion's passed, 11-0.
So colleagues, what that means is that we've de-Steved and we are going to re-Steve shortly. We are going to go to a ballot for this. And as a result, we're getting that ballot ready. So I thought it'd be appropriate if we'd ask each of the individuals to speak. Councillor Lehman was insistent anyway, so it felt like the appropriate thing to do. So if I could ask Councillor Turner and then Councillor Lehman, please, to make a few comments with respect to their candidacy for this position. Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Your Worship. This is one I'd expressed interest in when we sat at the beginning of the term to look for opportunities for boards. I think the convention center is one of our key pillars in our economic development for the city and the core. And I would really appreciate the opportunity to be involved with that. As mentioned, I currently sit on no boards or commissions, as those opportunities that I sought didn't come materialize at that time. This is a good opportunity for me to be able to contribute to the workload of this council as well, and I think it's all in keeping and works out well. So I'd appreciate if I had the support of my colleagues.
Thank you very much. Councillor Lehman.
Thank you, Your Worship. I look at what I can bring to the table at that board. Having been in business for 30 years, I do have a certain business background, and London Convention Center is a business that works to seek to attract other businesses. So I think I can be beneficial both in the operational side and also on the marketing side. And also having a business in the core, I know I've experienced and seen what works and what doesn't work. I recognize the value, the tremendous value that London Convention Center brings, not only to the core, but to the City of London. And I would appreciate your consideration for this position.
Thank you. As the ballots make their way to us, I thought it would be in all of our interests if we carried on, and in so doing, I'll turn your attention to 4.3, confirmation of appointments to the Old East Village Business Improvement Area. And you will see a revised confirmation letter on pages 255, 256. So I'll look for a motion, if I may, to accept the confirmation of these appointments. Deputy Mayor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Pelosa. Comments or questions with respect to this? Then I'll turn your attention on the screen as we vote on this confirmation of appointments.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 11-0.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I'll now take us back to 4.2. You'll see in front of you the ballot for the Convention Center Council member. Now, so there's no confusion. I know we only have two candidates. I would turn to the clerk. Does it matter as we vote for two or one at this point, or any particular order? Does it matter? Would that be redundant? As in one or two?
That's a good question.
It's a very good question, I think. If I may.
Use 1 and 2.
We should have it in that order. So if you've only checked off one, you might,
Well, we'll just assume the other one's 2.
perfect. Logic abounds. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Let's go to deferred matters and additional business. 5.1, we are looking for one individual council member to sit on this particular council, and I'm wondering if we have someone who might well have an interest in said committee. It pays the same as the London Convention Center, I should tell you, it's, if you're curious. Well, then we will refer that to another meeting if, in the comfort of your thoughts, and as we have balance of council here, there may well be someone who has expresses an interest. So this deferred matter will be deferred, if I can. So could I look for a motion to defer the deferred motion? Councillor Lewis, seconded by Councillor Hillier. Comments or questions? I'll turn your attention to the screen as we vote. Sorry, Councillor Morgan, we don't tell secrets, but he said we should appoint someone who's not here. I thought that was quite clever, actually.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 11-0.
So we're going to start a transition over here. I am going to be deferring 4.1 to Councillor Morgan, who's responsible for said items, and we are just going to do a little switch over, and then during that process, we should get the result of the vote as well. So I'll just ask you to bear with us, colleagues, for a moment.
Okay, I think we're going to start with 4.1 because we don't quite have the results of the ballot for the London Convention Center complete, but we'll jump into that when it's finished. So 4.1 is the review of city services for potential reductions and eliminations. There's also two addeds related to this item. One is a request for delegation status from Mr. Chris Butler. The other is a piece of correspondence from Mr. William H. Brock. We will need to deal with both of those. The correspondence we can receive, the delegation status we can deal with. But I think what I'd like to do first is go to our staff on the presentation of the report and some comments on what they put together for us. And then I'd like to outline a potential process. And then at that point, I think we could entertain the idea of a potential delegation status so that the delegate knows exactly the procedure that we're following today, should we allow the delegate to speak. And that will be up to a motion and a vote of council, of course. So I'll go to our staff first.
Thank you, through the chair. So what I had intended to do is just to walk you through very, very quickly what you have in front of you in terms of the report. So really what we tried to do is to pull together a summary of all of the tools that we're currently utilizing today so that you know what you are able to include in tonight's discussion versus things that we've already looked at. So on page 6, we have the little wheel where we look at all of our service review tools. So throughout all of the items around there, right from our continuous improvement program, zero-based budgeting, our deep dive service reviews, those are all things that staff have been doing. And included in the appendix is a summary of the savings that have been identified to date, a majority of which we have been able to realize savings through our zero-based budgeting. That has been a very important tool as we've reviewed and been able to report back on savings and cost avoidance going forward. That has not only created efficiencies, but as well as cost savings that will carry us through and have been ongoing into the future. So the other item that we have as a result is our deep dive service reviews. We have 3 that are already in progress at this time, being our housing, we have user fees, as well as golf services that are currently in process right now. So the appendice walks you through what the tools are, and the summaries provide you some details in terms of what we've done, in addition to looking at some of the continuous improvement things which have been able to realize efficiencies and cost avoidance going forward, and some of which are really challenging to quantify because they've relieved us from having to deal with costs that otherwise would have been incurred. So when we look at all of that, there's a number of things that Civic Administration have been doing and will continue to do going forward to continue to look at efficiencies and ways to mitigate tax increases going forward. The reason that we are here to have this report in front of you, in addition to that, is we've provided a listing of all of our service profiles that give you a very good idea in terms of what are all the services and the sub-services that City of London currently provides. So in the words of Mr. Hayward, what we've done is tonight's discussion is about pulling things out at the root. It's no longer looking at a haircut. In order to, if council wishes us to look for further reductions and or service efficiencies going forward, efficiencies we're doing, it's the reductions that would actually bring us significant savings going forward, which in either in the form of stopping to do something entirely or reduce the service. So I think in the past, we've had a number of things where Civic Administration have brought things forward. In a lot of cases, the changes or reductions were not palatable to councils and they were not implemented in the past. So what we're looking for this evening is a very clear direction if there are areas that council feels are palatable for us to review so that we can go and do that work and bring something forward. And in some cases, we'll need some time to be able to review and they may take some time to be able to implement, but at least if we start that process now, it will be able to give us some time to start to implement over the course of the multi-year. So.
Thank you. So colleagues, I'll take questions from you of our treasurer in a moment, but given the purpose of this meeting, which stems from a motion that council passed, which you can see on page 5 at the bottom, that the matter of service reductions or eliminations for specific services be added to a future agenda of the SPPC in order for the SPPC to provide direction to Civic Administration for additional reviews that may be undertaken. So In speaking with our treasurer, the purpose of today is not necessarily to cut or reduce the service. It's to identify areas that colleagues would like to raise for additional information to be brought back in the budget process. So if there is an area that you would like reviewed in more depth with the idea that you'd like to reduce or cut the service and understand the impacts of that, both from a service perspective as well as from how much it would actually save in the budget, this would be the meeting to identify that. Given that our staff have limited time on their hands, the way I would like to proceed is to have colleagues raise and debate ideas that we would then add to a list. When we have that list, I'll go to Ms. Barbone and her team to discuss whether or not they could achieve that and under what sort of time frame they could. If we create a very complex, very large list of items, it will be impossible to do them all, in which case, if the advice is we can't achieve all of this under the time frame for this multi-year budget, my preference would be for us to then go through a process of ranking them or dropping things off so that they could do as much of the work as possible, bring back the information we have, and then deal with that in the budget process. If council had things that were ranked low that they still wanted to do, obviously we could deal with a service reduction in an update in the multi-year budget through that process in a subsequent year. But the purpose of today is to identify the types of things that will come back to the budget process for our treasurer to provide information on, and then we can make the decision knowing the impacts on whether or not to proceed with that through the budget debate. So that's how I intend to proceed. If anybody also wants to comment on proceeding a different way, I'd certainly entertain that, but I think that would be the most efficient way for us to have the discussion, do something that is manageable within the scope of our staff's time, and achieve the result that council intended when it passed the motion. So if there are no ideas, it'll be a very quick meeting, and it won't take very long at all. If there are lots of ideas, we'll have to go through that process. So I'll open it up to questions of our treasurer, and then what I'd like to do is deal with the delegation status before we get into the actual debates and ideas. I'll go to Councillor Squire and then Councillor Lewis.
Through you, Mr. Chair, my first question is, one of the things I've learned from being on a border commission is that, which somewhat surprised me, was that there was an indication of border commission that they've already been given instructions that they are only to submit an increase of 1.5% per year in their budgets. And I just want to know how that fits into what you've identified as being 2.2% increase for status quo as the first part of the question. Second part is, have city departments been given an instruction to limit their increase also to 1.5%? I'm just not sure how they fit together.
Ms. Barbone.
Thank you, through the chair. So yes, civic departments as well as boards and commissions were all given specific increases and targets to try to meet towards. So one of the things that we did when we presented in May in terms of our targets, we're looking at a 2.2% for maintain existing service levels. What that's comprised of is the component that's the operational, which is all of the service areas, including the assumptions we've made with the boards and commissions. But in addition, there's a percentage, and I don't have that right handy in front of me, but there is a percentage of that specifically with respect to the capital component and servicing our increased cost to support the capital over the 10-year plan. So there is a percentage above that then supports the capital. That's also includes some of the projections to continue our pay-as-you-go financing to decrease the capital levy supporting our life cycle maintenance over a period of time. So there is a little bit of funds set aside for that as well as all of the capital, which there's cost increases that are a little bit higher and a little bit different than what we would see in our operational budgets. So all of that combined through our projections get us to that 2.2% that we had identified as a maintain existing service levels. The additional amount was specifically identified for service improvements potentially if council wished to do something new and or some of the provincial downloading now that we have experienced. So that's how we roll it up to get to that 2.2, was specifically based on some of the projections that we had for challenges across to balance off all of the areas.
Thank you. That was extremely clear. Now I have a complete understanding of that. Thank you very much. The other thing I want to understand is, is staff continuing with service reviews of your own initiative. I got that sense you are. And if that's the case and you find savings, how will that fit into the budget process? In other words, I certainly would not want to hear about that at the end of the budget process or midway through the budget process. I would be a lot more comfortable knowing beforehand what cuts have been identified for staff. So if you could help me with that, that would be great.
Thank you, through the chair. Yes, Civic Administration is absolutely continuing to use all of those service review tools that are included in that chart. So our zero-based budgeting will continue. All of the other continuous improvement initiatives that we have through the organization to look at how we continue to do cost avoidance, because that's a very important part of that. It's trying to ensure we can mitigate what we foresee coming in terms of pressures in the future as well. So that is absolutely part of our plan to continue that. One of the things that we are starting to find, and we'll report out on September on our achievement of the target for 2019, but it is getting more challenging to identify things that don't impact service levels specifically as we start to get closer and closer to the budget. So one of the things we will do as part of 2020 is those processes will still continue. 2020's budget will be set based on where we foresee costs to be. So right now, what we're hoping is that as we continue that work, as we find things, that we would continue to bring that forward so that they can be applied to the following year's budget, specifically as we know a little bit more certainty what's there. That was certainly one of the things that we plan on doing, but certainly council has we could look at something similar. I mean, the problem is that if we aren't able to achieve it, then there could be an issue down the road. So we're, at least for 2020, looking at this point to try to build that right into the 2020 budget that we submit, and then look at the future years to bring them in advance of the following through the updates.
I would add that we also have 3 reviews that council has tasked KPMG with, one on housing, one on golf, and one on user fees, and all of those will be completed in time for the multi-year budget process. So we have those as well that will be reported to us. Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, a question to our staff, and it actually relates to the service reviews that are already underway, because I noted in this report that we've talked about, cost avoidance on court matters when people are contesting infraction notices and things like that. But does our review of user fees include what we're currently charging at municipal parking meters and parking lots?
Ms. Parpon.
Through the chair, I think I'm not 100% certain of that answer. I believe we're looking at a broader, and then we're specifically narrowing it down to a couple of areas. So I don't know that it will go specifically to that level of parking, but I think right now, the review is still in process, and we're looking at areas that make sense in terms of probably a little bit higher review to target specifically. So I'm not sure if it will specifically include that item in particular, but we can go back and look if there's anything that warrants that in the future.
Councillor Van Holst. Okay, Mayor Holder.
Thanks very much. Through you, Chair. As we know, we had some consideration of deferral from the provincial government with respect to anticipated financial impacts to our budgets and the cost of doing business. I'm still mindful that's hanging out there, and I'm not sure that whole story has yet been told, and I'm trying to get a sense of how we do our best to budget for that, knowing that some parts of that I believe are unknown. I just wonder if staff, through you, could give us either some comfort or best guess or hope or feeling as to what that might look like, being mindful that there are knowns and there are unknowns as well. And I just ask you to comment on that, please.
Ms. Parpon.
So through the chair, I think based on the most recent report, that's the information that we have today in terms of what we're estimating. I think certainly from our perspective, a lot of it will be using our very best judgment in terms of what we think will actually occur. Versus some things that potentially could change. But I think that the simplest way to deal with that will be through some contingency that we would be able to support that process if we certainly aren't able to get that crystal ball just right. And I think certainly this was referenced in our most recent discussion with our Moody's. And I think when they reviewed the provincial changes that had occurred, they specifically cited London as being well poised to weather that storm. And I think that's where, through the use of our contingency funds, that's where we'll be able to help balance that if we don't quite get exactly what occurs. So I think that's certainly, as we look at it, we do have a contribution that we have that set aside that we look at specifically. Certainly if there's a deficit, that's what would stopgap that way. And we would monitor that, and that'll be part of, I think that's where the updates become extremely important. So in the 4-year, if there's things that we're really not sure of, that's where we would defer to possibly the following year to make those changes as required through the update when there's more information. So that'll be, as we're going through right now, we're assessing everything in terms of what we think will happen. We will certainly be conservative in our estimates to ensure that we don't have any surprises, but also set aside appropriate contingency and methods to be able to assist us should funding eliminate sooner or later than what we were anticipating.
Okay, that exhausts the speakers list. Now, we can do questions again after the delegation consideration, but I'd like to deal with that now. The added communication, the clerk has informed me, we can deal with receiving that added communication when we deal with the overall motion. So if someone wants to deal with the content of that, certainly come up with the debate, but we can receive the communication from Mr. Brock when we deal with the motions before us at the end of the meeting. So there's a request for delegation status from Mr. Butler. Sorry, not for me. So I'd like to have council deal with that now. So the way that would work is someone would need to move a motion for a 5-minute delegation from Mr. Butler. It would need to be seconded, and then we would vote on it. Councillor Van Holst, are you looking to move that? Okay, seconded by Councillor Squire. Any discussion on that, or we can move to Councillor Turner?
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chair. I would say in this circumstance, this is something that is pertinent to the budget. We have a pretty robust public consultation process with the budget. This is talking about the preliminary pieces as we put those forward. So I'm not quite sure it's the most appropriate time for a delegation, but I would defer to the committee.
Okay, anybody else want to comment? We have a moved and seconded motion to grant the delegation for 5 minutes. Okay, seeing none, we will deal with that on the screen.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 9-3.
Okay, Mr. Butler, you've been granted delegation status, so you can approach the microphone that is closest to you. We will turn it on. When you start, I'll ask you, even though we have your name and address, to state your name and address for the public record and for those watching, and then you can proceed with 5 minutes, or up to 5 minutes of content. With this, there isn't back and forth question and answer. It's basically share the information you'd like with the committee, and then we will proceed with the meeting today. So if you'd like to start, we'll start the timer then, and I will let you know when you're approaching the 5-minute mark.
Okay, I thought it was there. Thanks for accepting that, and I appreciate it. Basically, I'd just like to cover points 2 and 3 and maybe get a question answered at the end, because it is a different process, and go from there. Number 2, we were talking about continuous improvements, service improvements, that sort of thing. Any leading organization that I've worked with, always when they look at service cuts and things of that nature, always moves forward a little quicker on continuous improvements ideas. And I think that in those circumstances, the response from staff is even greater than normal, because the other options are not as pretty. So I'd like to look at basically forwarding to council to review what those service levels should be, or what those targets should be for 2020-24, the upcoming budget. Maybe this isn't meeting to do it, but I think a reasonable target would be 0.30 of the ops budget, which is about 1/10 of what it would be in a mature private sector industry. So I think we have started with some baby steps. We've become used to it as a council and for citizens, and I think that we have a lot of opportunities to go forward in that direction. The other thing on that is where the money gets assigned from that. When I look through the list and when I talk to finance staff, I know that a lot of the cost savings there are assigned back to the immediate department. The CIP program was one of that. That was 45% of our cost savings last year, and it got immediately assigned back to the department to spend. The third point is basically, I read through the KPMG stuff in this report and just asked you to consider something. I don't think it really highlights in this format and can, for what you're looking at, to look for programs that have rapidly accelerated way beyond inflation, that aren't capped, that produce excessive liabilities for taxpayers as we go down the road. I don't think that the format you're going to look at today really does that, and that might be an option for council and Chair Morgan to look at, to sort of look at basically where we can look in terms of those. These are rapid inflation programs that are shared with many departments, and they really don't reflect. I don't want to pick on the CIP people. That's one of them that we already know, and it comes with unlimited liabilities for taxpayers. No cap on it. There's no meaningful forecast. We don't know where we're going with that program. This is for the tax downtown. The last item, and I was hoping to get a question answered because nobody at my breakfast club and two people at the pop-up for finance gave me different answers a week and a half ago. I really don't know if the black parts of the bars that are in the report that you folks are looking at today are my obligation to pay automatically. If they're downloaded to me, or is there a vote for council? I'm very unclear about that, and the four people who went to breakfast with who were talking about it on Saturday are equally unclear. That's all I have.
Sorry, thanks for your delegation, Mr. Butler. I do want to get you an answer to your question, but can you just explain what you're talking about with that last question part? I just want to make sure we're clear so we can get you an answer.
Well, the question is, I looked at the report, and part of the graph is what Lisa Ann was talking about, the downloading from the government. That black part of the bar, I don't know whether we're obligated to take that in right away, or it's a vote of council to take that.
Okay, I got the question. Thank you for your delegation. Yeah. So maybe I'll go to Ms. Barbon, if you can provide some information on the black portions of the bar. He's referring to page 4. So you have the inflationary pressure for status quo services, and then the provincial budget impacts, which is spread over 2 years. The question is, are we obligated to take those on, and the way that we spread them across the years, why they've been done the way that they have?
Thank you, through the chair. So the provincial budget impacts are specifically related to the costs that have been now through the provincial legislation changed that require the municipality to pay. So the reason we've shown it in this regard is, one, we have to pay them. It's not an obligation that we're able to say, no, thank you, we're not going to participate. In most cases, those are representative of cost shares that are now different, that have increased for mandatory programs that we're obligated to fund. So the reason we've put that in 2020 is because that's when, although they were originally scheduled to take effect in 2019, they've been deferred to 2020. So those costs that the municipality will need to cost share in will begin in 2020. So that's the reason we've included them there. Whether we're able to spread them out a little bit through the use of contingencies or alternative financing vehicles, that will be subject to budget deliberations in terms of what other choices council will choose to make for the overall tax levy.
Okay, thank you. And I think if there are further questions on that, Mr. Butler, there will be lots of opportunities for engagement through the budget process, and you can consult with Ms. Barbon's office to get further clarification on those. So that concludes the delegation. So we're back to 4.1. So we'll certainly continue with questions of the treasurer if there are any furthers, and obviously we can ask questions of our staff throughout. I know that Councillor Cassidy, you've arrived. I just want to outline the process I've suggested is for councillors to suggest areas that they would like to be considered for service reductions or savings or whatever, however you want to articulate it. We'll put those on the floor. We'll discuss them. If there's consensus, we'll add them to a list. If there isn't consensus, we'll vote to add them to a list. At the end of the meeting, we're going to take a look at that list. Ms. Barbonas is going to provide some discussion. If they can't do all of that in time for the budget process, we're just going to prioritize it so that they can bring back the information. So we're not making any decisions today. We're just basically outlining what are the types of things that we want back for further service review or more information or potential impacts of reducing the service. And I just want to make sure we can fit all that in with staff's time. So obviously, if there are any questions about that process, colleagues can ask, but that's the way that I've suggested that we proceed. So are there any other questions of our staff, knowing that we can ask throughout the process tonight? Okay, then it's open floor time. If you have a suggestion or idea based on all the information that's been presented to you on areas that you'd like to look into, now's the time for councillors to make suggestions. And so I will open the floor for that. Councillor Turner.
Thank you. I happen to agree with a couple of the points Mr. Butler made, and I think those are worthy of investigation, specifically the downtown and industrial CIPs, and the rate at which we do the discounting. I think both for industrial and downtown CIPs, the discounting is 100%. So there may be opportunities to do a reduced discounting, perhaps 75 or 50% or something along those lines. But I think it would be worth investigating and understanding what the impact to that might be, especially with downtown, since the development charges will help to pay for new infrastructure that supports the growth that we're trying to promote downtown. Otherwise, we've got to bring that onto the levy itself. So I think that's a good opportunity for some cost recuperation. So those would be the two that I'd start with. I've got a couple others too, but I think we're probably going idea by idea rather than batch by batch.
Yeah, I'd like to go by idea, because if there's consensus, we can add that to the list. So I'll open this suggestion that Councillor Turner wants to add the industrial and downtown CIP levels as an area to get more information back from our staff on in the budget process, with the idea of potentially reducing the percentage of those programs. If I understand, obviously that, the level will be the type of information we get back and the impacts. Discussion on this. If there's consensus, we can add it to the list. Councillor Helmer.
Just a question through the chair. Is Councillor Turner talking about the downtown and industrial CIP programs only, or the downtown and say Oldies Village CIP programs?
Councillor Turner.
At this point, I'm speaking specifically to those two that I mentioned. I'm not including the Old East one because I think that's a different matter.
Councillor Helmer.
I think it's potentially helpful to hear from our staff about the changes we made to the development charges grants program, just so people understand the most recent round of changes that were made. Those were made not that long ago, and they did limit to some extent the financial liability, and essentially the buildings pay back the grant with the taxes from the new building over a period of time, and it's kind of like, rather than having the grant come up front. So this is a bit of a better way, and I wonder if our staff, especially finance perhaps, could explain how that new program is functioning. Not the industrial stuff, but just the downtown.
So just a quick review of the change we made to the downtown CIP, where basically we solved the cash flow issue with it. And Councillor Helmer's just looking for a refresher of our memory of the change we've made and why.
So through the chair, the treasurer has given me permission to speak on a financial matter. That's great. The review was undertaken a couple of years ago, and we looked at putting a cap on the whole thing because the gentleman was quite correct about it being uncapped. We actually tied it into the uplift in taxes, and we limited it over a 10-year period. And then we do a phase out of the CIP and the property tax piece. It's all parceled in the same piece, but the amount of money that we're actually giving out is tied to the amount of money that we're taking in by way of new buildings and new assessment and that type of thing. So there is a bit of a limitation there. And I believe overall, now this was the review of the entire CIP, I believe we saved close to $600,000 per year. And the bulk of that was actually given back to the taxpayer by way of reductions, but some of it was reused as well for other incentives. So that's a very high-level summary.
Other questions or discussion on Councillor Turner's suggestion? Again, we can get information back. We can also rank these. We can also deal with eliminating them later. But if people are comfortable with that being on the list, I'll just look for consensus. If not, we'll just have a vote about adding it to the list for now. Okay. Consensus? Yeah? Okay, so there's one item on the list so far. Other ideas? Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you for recognizing me. I just want to follow up on Mr. Butler's comments about the black bars and the provincial downloading. And just through you, Mr. Chair, to staff, just understanding, is there a possibility, because we know most municipalities are going to be experiencing the downloading from the provincial government. And I also heard from Ms. Barone that municipalities, we have to pay for it. So as we go through this budgeting process, is there an opportunity that we can see that difference of the downloading, that we don't really have a choice but to pay, or is it just sort of going to be sort of wrapped up in other figures being brought to us?
Ms. Barbone.
Through the chair, just to make sure I understand the question, and I believe what you're asking is, will we be disclosing what the costs of the provincial downloading are separately from our budget documents? Is that correct? I see nod. So absolutely, we are looking at quantifying and breaking that out so that we can clearly disclose to council what those pieces are through our budget documents. So I know most areas, as they're going through their budget development process right now, because it's their core business, will likely include it, and then we'll be looking to follow up and review so we can ensure that that's clearly articulated so that council is aware of what those costs are in totality.
Thank you. I think it's really important that we, as a council, understand the differences in what we're responsible for. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Councillor Squire.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm really think this is a valuable process, and I'm really mindful of the time commitment. I'm also mindful of the fact that in some of these areas, we are going to be able to deal with them, I think, without a review. Economic development is coming forward to us through the renewal of the contracts. Certainly Tourism London, we're going to have to talk about the tax benefit they're getting as it relates to their current budget. And I appreciate the housing review. But the one area that's been raised to me, quite frankly, through constituents, through correspondence, some of it in different manners, has been the issue of information technology and the budget for information technology. And I'm not aware of any review having taken place to date, but we're talking about $18 million in expenditures in that area. I don't know if there's savings, and I think that's the challenge with this process. I would take some issue with the idea that it automatically will lead to cuts. I don't know that. But I think the service review in that area is important at this point in time, and it's particularly important for me because of the public requests I've received that this is an area that we should be looking at. So I'd like to do a review of that aspect.
I think there was I don't know if there was a question in there about, maybe we can get some information about when the last review of that area was, or if it was included in any other of the service review activities that were articulated in the report, and then we can move forward from there.
Through the chair, there were some reviews that we did a number of years ago on IT. I remember one time we actually cut $200,000 out of that budget and started to look at how we might better roll out in a more efficient way. And there were a number of changes that we made on a number of fronts in that particular area to actually make it more efficient. One of the things with the IT budget is it consists a lot of licenses and equipment costs and so on that are required in the whole process. So That's a bit of a different function over and above all the programming staff and whatnot that we have to keep the systems running. But certainly it is something we've done in the past, and then we actually flatlined the budget for a few years as well, which has the effect of causing people to try to become more efficient and more effective in their processes. So we have done it in the past. I don't believe we've done it recently. I'll look to the treasurer for that, but it is something we continually look at in terms of trying to ratchet down the costs, even in terms of negotiation on contracts and things like that. So those are areas we always look at.
Two things from that. It says to me that you haven't done it recently. But the second thing is, if you have done it in the past, it's going to provide a base for you to do a further review that could serve as some kind of an update. So I'm going to ask that be put on the floor. And if my colleagues don't want to do it, that's the decision that will be made.
I just want to make sure I understand what we're putting on the floor. Are you asking for like a regular kind of, we have the service review toolkit outlined on page 6. If you're asking for us to kind of apply our regular service review to IT prioritizing that, or are you asking for a specific, like something specific brought back with respect to a service reduction or anything?
No, it's the first. It's a service review.
I don't know if our treasurer wants to comment on the process of service review and whether that is something that you'd see as appropriate for this process.
So through the chair, that is something that through the budget development process that all of the management team, we've gone through line by line and compared it specifically to every single contract that we have. A large number, as Mr. Hayward has said, is specifically tied to line licenses and contracts and things that we get a bill for with respect to supporting all of our services. So we've done a number of things through the review of our print contract that just recently came forward, our mobile contract as well, where we've incorporated those savings already as part of some of the service review savings we've brought forward. So that is something that we've done ongoing over the last number of years, specifically through staff, as well as this year through the last couple of months, looking at every single contract and opportunities for cost reductions to mitigate some of the cost increases that we actually have to try to mitigate that are nowhere near the 1.5% that we have to try to absorb. So that has been an active process over the last little period of time to do that. So, I mean, certainly we're in council's hands, but that is something we've very actively been pursuing.
So Councillor Squire, I just want to go back to you. So you'd like this added to the list? Okay, so Councillor Squire would like to add a review of the information technology space to come back in the budget process. I just want to be specific about what we're asking because I want to make sure it's possible to get the information back. So there's a difference, I think, between the prioritization in our service review kind of toolkit model and then bringing back information to the budget process with the types of questions and information that's been asked. Here's the stuff we've done in the area before and whether or not we can prioritize it. So do you want to add like prioritization of this in a service review, or do you want to add something different? Do you know, I just want to be very specific because I see some councillors shaking their heads on exactly what it means, and I just want to make sure that we know.
Well, there may be areas that they've already reviewed, and I appreciate that. But there's other areas which have not been mentioned by the treasurer or the city manager that has been raised to me, and there's staffing issues, the number of, degree to which the department has been staffed, the number of managers, those sort of things. And I would like to at least hear back about what the view of staff is on that. Again, I'm not saying that I've noticed something that, it's very difficult as a councillor for me to sit here now and say, well, this is what I recognize that needs to be cut today, because I haven't gotten the information back from staff. So when staff says to me today, as we're sitting here, well, we've already done all that and reviewed everything, I think that's great. But first of all, it doesn't really address the things, and I'm making them very specific now, that I've heard about. And I just, for responding to my constituents and the issues they've raised, I would like it reviewed. If it's something you've already reviewed and that is the answer, I'm happy if you give me that answer. I'm not talking, for you to review that ground again, but certainly the issue of staffing and IT has been raised to me on a number of occasions, so I'll bluntly put it right out there.
Okay, so that's what Councillor Squire would like added to the list. I see a number of hands up, so I'm going to go through the list. I have Councillor Turner.
Thank you.
I missed some hands over here, I'm sorry.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just really quickly to that point, I recognize what Councillor Squire is looking to do. I think I'm not sure it gets done in a timely enough manner to be able to be applicable to the budget process in the immediate for our deliberations. However, I see the value and merit in that in helping to achieve those efficiency targets that are distributed over the course of the budget. And I'd imagine that as you go through a service review, those are where you start to find those findings of $1 million or $2 million a year that we give as a global target for general cost reductions. But an $18 million program to do a service review, unless it's focused, doesn't yield as much as one might think it does. I know most program service reviews tend to be about 6 months in length in order to do a good process through that. And we also have the external audit, the internal audit opportunities to be able to take a look and see if those kind of components of the program can find further efficiency. So I'm not sure it helps us in our budget deliberations because a service review I don't think could be executed quickly enough prior to our overall budget deliberation, but I think it would be an essential tool towards getting towards those global figures that we might put like we did in the last multi-year budget.
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Point out that what we're doing today could be partially an iterative process. So what could be done is have staff bring us a summary of what has been looked at and what hasn't been looked at and where there is some potential savings. And then we could decide from seeing that where a deeper review could go. We could direct that because IT is a very big file. And we have, through the audit committee, already seen portions of that where it's, in some cases, performing very strongly. And so I think staff could bring a summary of the things we've seen already. We might be able to narrow that request down, although Councillor Squire has picked some more narrow focuses already.
Other discussion? Councillor Helmer.
I'm not convinced that this is an area that needs reductions. So, I mean, I'm not interested, frankly, in having the staff look at it. I think actually it's the opposite, which is this is probably an area that needs more resources. So we have had a number of excellent reports through Corporate Services Committee about how we've saved a lot of money. The print contract comes to mind. There's a number of them that are listed out in the report that come from the IT area. And they say, we negotiated the wireless contract with Rogers. We used the Ontario government contracting option. It saved us a whole bunch of money. We figured out how to do the master print contract better, and now we're getting the same service for less money. So, when I see an area that's actually reducing things and saving money and getting better service, I'm not thinking I should pull back resources from that area. So I'm not willing, based on what I've heard so far, to vote for that one. I don't think I'm going to support it at this point.
Okay, other discussion on this one? Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you to my colleagues. I appreciate where Councillor Squire is looking to find some savings here. I hear from staff that, and I know from my own knowledge of the technology world, that things are changing rapidly and licensing fees are becoming a much bigger part of the budget. It sounds like our asset reviews in terms of our equipment is something that has been looked at relatively recently, but I feel like what Councillor Squire is suggesting here is that maybe it's a Lean Six Sigma or an organizational review of the department in terms of how it's structured, and are there some synergies to find in savings in working, across platforms with other departments, perhaps in some cases where we can find savings. So I'm open to the discussion, but I guess through you, I'm still looking for some clarification on what service review tools we're looking to apply here, because I think when we talk about things like licensing and those kind of things, I don't want staff to spend time doing something that we've already done. But when I hear, staffing levels and those things. That speaks to me more of an organizational structure review. So I'm just, before I'm comfortable supporting this, I'm just trying to get some clarity on what tools we're looking to apply here.
Councillor Squire.
Well, I'm a city councillor, and I rely on staff to recognize what tools would be best applied to a particular problem. And so so far staff seems somewhat reluctant to go into this area. They haven't offered any tools, and I understand that. Maybe they're going to disagree with me now, but, staff, I think there's a somewhat responsibility on staff to say, well, at least we hear what you're saying. We may not agree with you, but here's a tool that we may be able to apply to this to provide council with some more information. And that's where I am at this point in time. I'm not in a position of having received any more information than any other councillor has had. So if you were to ask me to come up with some kind of legal tool to apply to something, I could do that very easily. Lean Six Sigma, frankly, it's a name I've heard, but I'm not an expert. So that's the best I can do.
Mr. Hayward.
So through the chair, I just want to point you to page 11 at the bottom, and there's a program review of mobile devices, which is all done through our information technology. On page 18, Appendix C, the third point down, there is a cost avoidance of $320 that came about as a result of a zero-based budget review of our technology services, and that's what Ms. Barbon's saying. One of the things that I heard from the councillor, from Councillor Squire specifically through the chair, is to look at the staffing overview. Well, that would be something that we would probably discuss in camera, so I'm not going to raise it here. Have we done it before? Yes. Many years ago, but we have done it before. So that would be something that we would want to discuss in camera, because I'd need to know a little bit more about what we're after in that sense. The other piece is, we would then, we are moving forward on a number of other fronts in terms of our IT folk, looking at Lean Six Sigma, which is basically trying to cut out all the fat out of our processes, make them far more efficient so we can deliver things more efficiently, which actually leads to cost avoidance down the road, so the budget's not growing as much, and actually is beneficial to the rest of the organization as well. So that's the balance that we're trying to create here in terms of this. Am I averse to looking at anything? No, I'm not averse to looking at anything. The only factor that comes to play there is the resources in order to be able to do that in time for the budget. So that's why we need sort of some prioritization on it.
The discussion? If not, I'm going to try to help, because I do want this to be clear, and then I'm going to go to Councillor Squire to make sure, because I certainly don't want to put words in another councillor's mouth, especially when they're asking for a request. So from my understanding of when we add information technology to the list, what it could look like from a functional standpoint is bring back a summary of what we have done and potential areas and tools that we could use to look into it further. And then Councillor Squire would have more information as part of the budget process to provide some direction in some way. I just want to make sure that sounds good. Okay, so that's what we would be adding to the list. If colleagues agree, it sounds like not everybody agrees, so I think we'll just make this one a vote to add to the list or not. And again, we will decide on submitting the full list at the end, depending on how much work it is. But I don't know if staff, is that clear on what we're asking now, if I articulate it that way? Good, I see nods. Okay, so that's what we're talking about with adding this to the list. Is there any other discussion, or would you like to vote? And again, this is not vote to approve it, this is a vote to add it to the list. We will address the entire list and approve it at the end. So this is just getting it on a list, since there isn't consensus on this. Okay, so we're gonna have a motion to add IT to the list for consideration. The IT Infotech review. Is there a seconder for that, to add something to the list? Okay, Councillor Lewis. We're going to put that on the screen. Councillor Squire, I'm going to have you look at it before we actually open the vote to make sure you're comfortable with it since it's your idea, and then we can open it for a vote. Okay, if you click current item, you should be able to see the wording now, Councillor Squire. Okay, Councillor Squire is fine with that wording. It's been moved and seconded. Other discussion? Councillor Van Holst?
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chair. Through you to our staff, it's been said that licensing is a very large part of the IT expense. Can we have an idea of how much that is of the around 16 million, I guess?
Do we have any idea how much licensing is of the IT budget?
So through the chair, out of the approximate $18 million, personnel is about half, and the remainder is between 3.4 for licensing. We have a transfer to fund our capital of $1.9 million. Our corporate telephone and mobile is 1.7, and then our print and photocopiers are about 860. We have office rent included in there, and our central, our lease computers are 433. So about half is technology related and half is personnel.
There's your answer. Okay, any further discussion? Otherwise, we can vote on this motion, which is to add this to the list. Okay, I'll open that for voting.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 8-4.
Okay, 2 items on the list now. I don't have anybody on the main speakers list, so this is, again, submitting ideas. Obviously, the more specific you are, the quicker the process will go. If you need questions of staff or information, we can certainly endeavor to get that for you as well. Councillor Van Holst.
Yes, I was considering putting the tree protection bylaw on, as part of the list, and that's something we passed last council. I think in that we're kind of telling people what they have to do, when I think we might be able to simply give them a context that it's great to have trees and leave it at that. I know that we've had to create a bit of a bureaucracy to deal with appeals when somebody wants to remove a tree and the staff didn't agree with that. I witnessed the appeal process. I didn't really care for it. In one instance, I was there pretty much an entire day. There was a decision on 2 trees that was made, and it's onerous for the residents. So I think we can. I would like to see us remove that and let people deal with that on their own. So in terms of residences, us trying to police what happens on someone's private residence, I don't think that's valuable.
So you would like the elimination of the private property tree protection bylaw as an item for consideration?
Yes.
Okay. Discussion on that. Councillor Lehman.
I was going to bring this up as well. I've had a number of instances where people have needed to remove trees for simple things like a tree was in danger of falling in the garage or building a deck. The process is quite onerous. It involves getting arborists, there's huge fees, and it's very arbitrary, the decision from the city as to whether they remove the tree or not. But in thinking about this, I thought more about Mr. Hayward's comments about if we're going to find substantial savings, we need to really look at deeper removal of the hair piece. I forget the follicle or whatever the comment was. So I know we're talking about a sacred cow here because we're the forest city. We have over 4 million trees. Trees are obviously a huge asset to our city. So I think we should go further. I think we should look at the urban forestry department. At over $4 million a year, what value are they adding to our city services that couldn't be done just through, let's say, our parks department? I understand this unit was formed not too long ago. And I'm just wondering if we need to relook or rethink this. You know, it's a nice to have. But at this time, we're having to look under every rock. And I think this should be looked at to see if it is indeed delivering value of over $4 million a year. The bylaw, for sure, being a part of it. And that's essentially what kind of got this on my radar. I saw this as encroaching bureaucratic red tape. That sometimes when you have a separate department, complexity comes with that new department. So that made me wonder, is there further things that are being done in the department that are inefficient, that are essential to the City of London that couldn't be serviced in other ways? So I would go further than Councillor Van Holst. I'd like to put the urban forestry on the list.
Okay, let's just deal with what Councillor Van Holst has suggested first, which is specifically a specific program that he would like to get information back on the costs and savings that would be related to its removal. Because I don't want to get into a big debate about the whole urban forestry department. I would also caution colleagues in my discussions with our staff leading up to this meeting, we can't just list a whole bunch of full departments as service reviews, otherwise we'd list the whole city, and frankly, we are going through a process of reviewing the specific departments through the regular service review process. So if what we're talking about today is specific items that you want information back for us to consider that will have a financial impact, the more specific, the better, because then very clear information can come back. I can tell you if we have general reviews of every department, we'll be prioritizing this list and not very many of them will get done in time for the budget process. So more specific is better. Councillor Van Holst's idea of a program, specific program, obviously costs and consequences associated with it, that is one I think that works very well in this process. But a whole department is going to run us into a little bit of an issue. Certainly very legitimate thing for an internal service review, an audit committee review, even internal and external audit, but I think in this process it's gonna consume a lot of the time. So obviously I'm at the will of the committee on what they'd like to do. I just wanted to share with you some of the discussions I had leading up to this committee about what would be functional, what wouldn't, given the amount of time that we have leading up to the multi-year budget process. So I just wanted to provide that context. The idea of adding the tree protection bylaw, I have Councillor Hopkins, Turner, and Cassidy on the list.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll just speak to the tree protection bylaw for now. And I understand we've undertaken the process for a number of years, and we've had to evaluate it and look at it and change it to make it better. And I would like to ask for you, Mr. Chair, to staff, I'm not sure if this question could even be answered, but where are we in the process?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have been taking a review of the tree protection bylaw. The vast majority of trees in London are actually on private property, so a lot of our forest canopy is affected by this bylaw. There's a PPM proposed, I believe, for September, and a report back at that time that would be coming to PEC.
Thank you. And so for me, I think I would caution my colleagues here that when we undertake a bylaw and when we investigate it and when we look into it and it's brought back to committee to have further reviews, it's not perfect at the moment, but do we just make a decision just to automatically get rid of it? I would encourage you to continue with this process. There has been a lot of effort, a lot of work done by staff to bring this forward, and I have concerns that when we just arbitrarily sit here and make a decision that we no longer need to do this, I have great concerns that we really understand this process that we've undertaken for many years.
Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I try to kind of take my frustration level down a little bit, but if we're going to spend the next 4 years trying to undo everything we did the last 4 years, I'm going to be pretty frustrated with their accomplishments at the end of the term. As Councillor Hopkins said, I think she's quite right. If you want to deal with this through the bylaw process, let's take a look at that as we go through the reviews. But to cut off its funding, I think is highly inappropriate. To Mr. Lehman's point, or Councillor Lehman's point, I think if you want to know what value trees have in this city, they absorb water and have a significant impact on our stormwater management. Without those trees, we would be paying tons and tons more in engineering in order to manage that stormwater. We would be spending lots and lots more in energy costs in order to try and promote cooling during summer months. And I think the two of those together, just on their own, but if we want to keep going and take a look at property values and trees and take a look at our general inventory of trees, we're not increasing the number of trees, we're net decreasing, and we're trying to get ahead of that. So it's the removal of trees as we develop more and more of our lands. We've had to put in significant policies in terms of significant woodlands criteria, both our boulevard tree and our private tree protection bylaws. We've had significant planting initiatives. Agencies such as Reforest London have the Million Tree Challenge over 10 years to just try and hold ground against the number of trees that we're losing on an annual basis. So if we're going to be serious about climate change, if we're going to be serious, but even let's leave that aside, just on pure economics alone, these programs make sense. And so am I frustrated about this? Yeah, I think it's probably, is it a sacred cow? Perhaps it is, but it's an appropriate one because this is something that we need to do as a community. We would be alone, I think, in municipalities if we had no urban forestry program. Anyway, these ones I find incredibly frustrating, and I hope this isn't the tone and the tenor as we go forward through this process.
Okay, I want to be cautious about not debating the merits of the item that councillors want to bring forward. I certainly understand that you may need to provide some context on why you do not support it being on the list, but I want to, and that's a tricky line to kind of cross, so I'm not saying anybody has done that, but let's try to keep it focused on, I know councillors are putting ideas out to be on a list where we're not making a decision yet. They're simply items they want more information on. It's perfectly fine for a member of council to say, I don't want to put that on the list. Here's why. And we don't put it on the list. So we're going to try to make sure we respect everybody's opinion, even if it's a program or an initiative that we care very much about, or even if it's one that maybe we dislike. So we're trying to generate some ideas. We will make a decision as a group, and not all of those ideas will make it on the list. So, but what I don't want to do is spend the whole evening bordering on debating the merits of a program when we're looking to just have some information. But I recognize that you need a little bit of context on why you would or would not support something. Councillor Cassidy, Councillor Lewis, Councillor Lehman, I have on the list so far, and Mayor Holder. Point of order, Mayor Holder.
Just as it relates to the comments you just made, Chair, I think context is the key point to this as opposed to the debate, and I just want to clarify that that was your intention, that we stick to context. Can you just clarify and just perhaps say that once more for the benefit of the long list?
All I was trying to clarify was, chairing the meeting, I was trying to assist colleagues along by saying we don't have to debate stuff in depth, but I recognize that there's a balance for people who want to get their point across on why or why not they want something on the list. So it was more a comment for colleagues to receive. Obviously, every member of council has the right to say whatever they want when it's their turn to speak. I'm just trying to make sure that we keep the meeting moving along. That's all. Thank you. Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Presiding Officer. Looking for context, seeking information in order to provide context. Through you to staff, when we enacted the tree protection bylaw, does that include all of the aspects, including tree protection zones?
So a question about what the tree protection bylaw includes.
Through the chair, I'll start with this one, and I may look for some help from some of my colleagues. This is a relatively new addition to my portfolio. I've usually had forestry operations, which is very focused on branches falling on the road and that sort of thing. The tree protection bylaw does include the protection zones, as far as I'm aware. And it would also include protection on various types of private property, which would be an important clarification if this does make the list. Are we only looking at residential, or do you wish to include commercial, institutional, and industrial uses as well?
So through you and probably to Mr. Kotsifas, since we enacted the tree protection bylaw, so it's not just a homeowner with a tree in the middle of their yard and they want a pool. We're talking about big tracts of land with lots of trees. So through you, Mr. Presiding Officer, has it changed how we work with developers seeking to develop a site? Or is there more effort put in to preserve more trees as opposed to just clear cutting a site in order to make it easy?
Through the chair, so the bylaw has multiple components to it. If a developer was to purchase a property and want to develop that land, if they are going through an approval process like a subdivision or a site plan, then that process captures the tree protection within that process. So they'll require a tree preservation plan, landscaping plans, things like that. If they want to jump ahead of the process and start cutting trees, there's kind of a couple of different layers to that. If they're in a tree protection zone, they need approval, particularly if the tree is greater than 50 centimeters. So it used to be 75 and council reduced it to 50 about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. So they would require approvals for those trees. So the bylaw is designed to protect large tracts of land, but it's also designed to protect mature trees, which are anyways, that's kind of just a thing.
Thank you. So because of that, I won't support this. I recognize, as Councillor Hopkins says, it's not perfect, and we can improve the process if that's what needs to happen. There have been many instances going in the past, before we had this bylaw, where people would go out in the middle of the night and clear a huge patch of land because they didn't want the hassle from the neighbors. So I don't want to go back to that. I won't support it.
Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I certainly have heard from a few constituents along the way about frustrations they have with the process, and particularly with certain species of trees that are nuisance trees, like black walnuts that are dropping things on their vehicles and causing damage. I understand that, but I too, I don't think that there's a cost savings to be realized here. I think there are are potential improvements to be made. I think that perhaps we can, work through the bylaw process and tweak some of these, make it easier on residential homeowners. But I also agree with much of what Councillor Turner said about the value of these trees to our community. And I think that the value that we get from protecting as many trees as possible is far greater than any cost savings that we might find through this process, because I don't think we would save all of the money that we're spending on the tree protection bylaw, or even in the urban forestry department if we just put it under Parks and Rec or just made some tweaks. We're still going to spend money in this area, so I think that we might be looking at nickels and dimes rather than big dollars. And again, I come back to, there are some nuisance trees and there are some improvements that we can perhaps make, but I would rather fine tune that than just toss away the work that's been done on this. So I don't think I can support this one.
Councillor Lehman.
I just want to make a comment here. We're going through a process where we're questioning. We asked staff to bring us a report of all the things we do as a city. And the tough thing with government is it's always easy to add and it's hard to cut. Because if you cut, well, I think we just saw it here. I'm not against trees. I think protection of our trees is critical in our city. All I was asking and suggesting is perhaps this is a department, because it's a fairly new department, if it's bringing value for the $4.2 million it's costing us here. That's it. We're never going to get anywhere if we take things to the extreme. And all we're doing is an organizational exercise to see if we're getting the most bang for the buck and if that service is highly desired. If you'd ask me, are tree protection services highly desired? Of course, 100%. If they said, well, if we put it under parks, we would lose some protection, or we would lose planning of the canopy, then I wouldn't support it. But that doesn't mean I don't think we should look at it. So I'm just some caution as we go down this road, to I guess consider things in a more practical sense.
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Mr. Budget Chair. Just to a couple of my colleagues' concerns, to Councillor Cassidy, I was specifically asking for the residential component of this and nothing else. So the people who do want a pool or a deck and have a tree, or want a different type of tree, or want a tree that's not on the fence line where it's destroyed the fence because a squirrel planted it years ago. And I would also say that we need information from staff on this. If there's no purpose of going through this exercise, if my colleagues can simply tell me ahead of time what will save nickels and dimes and what will save substantial amounts of money. So I would like that information. I suppose I'd point out that if I wanted, I could ask as an inquiry at the council meeting what removing this portion would save us. So that information is still available to me. But the other important thing about this, and we see it, and this was the one point I was trying to make, Mr. Chair, is that I don't believe that Councillor Turner is an outlier in his passion for trees. And nor do I think Councillor Hopkins or Cassidy or Lewis are outliers. People care about trees, and that can be good enough. We don't need to control them if they're going to move that in that direction anyway. So most of the trees will be protected because we care about trees. And in the instances where they become, as was described by Councillor Lewis, a nuisance, then we should let people remove those because they'll put up other trees. And I know that in the appeal that I was at, there was a woman who wanted to take down a big tree and wanted to plant fruit trees, a number of them, and we said no. And I don't think that's right. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think we have to meddle with people in that way because they want the same thing we want, and this will save us save us some money? I think it could. That's why I asked that this be removed. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Van Holst. I don't have anybody else on this one. Oh, sorry. I thought I did miss you. Councillor Squire and then Councillor Helmer.
Yeah, I just want to go, I didn't vote in favor of the tree protection bylaw, so obviously I'm going to be reviewing it. But I think, again, this is turning out exactly how I sort of expected. People would say, oh, here's something that I voted for last council. I love it. You guys are not going to touch it in any way. Like, you're not going to come near it. And that's too bad, in my opinion. It's too bad that we can't go back and say, you know what, let's have a review of something we did and see if the cost benefit is there. You know, I've certainly heard from constituents who say, I don't like that part of it, where if I want to cut down a tree and plant another one, and I love trees, that I have to go through this process and get an arborist. I just, you know, I think I should have the freedom to do what I want on my own property when I'm acting in a reasonable manner. And I tend to agree with that. But, you know, where we go from there, of course, is what I expected we would do, is start putting up saying, well, we don't even want to look at something. And so next time when I get up at budget time and say, you know, I want to cut something, and people say, well, you didn't bring anything to the table. Well, it's pretty hard to bring something to the table. So I'll be supporting Councillor Van Holst.
Councillor Helmer.
We have lots of different ways that we can influence the budget. And unfortunately, I think everything is kind of getting rolled into this one meeting, which is unfortunate. I think in retrospect, we probably should have seen that coming. This meeting, as far as I understand it, is about identifying areas to reduce service or eliminate service altogether, and that's it. It's not about making little small changes to things, and it's not about reviewing, you know, bylaws, and no, it's just about, is there a service you want to reduce the service level for? Like, we're gonna pick up the garbage every 2 weeks instead of every 8 days? That's a service level change. It's got budget implications. Do you want to eliminate something altogether? Like Councillor Lehman brought up urban forestry, said, let's just get rid of it. So, you know, if that's, and Councillor Van Holst, you know, he's saying tree protection bylaw specifically, I just want to eliminate it altogether. So I think if that's what we're talking about, I think that's fine, but we need to be very specific about it. It's one of the problems I had with the earlier discussion we had about information technology. I'm like, what are we talking about? Eliminating information technology? Or reducing it across the board, or a specific area, right? It's very difficult to talk about service level reductions or eliminations if we're not being really specific about what we mean. When it comes to the tree protection bylaw, I think it's reasonably good the way it is, and I don't want to eliminate it. I haven't heard any specific service level reductions that I think would make it better, or, you know, better value for money. I think a lot of the changes that are being discussed by Councillor Van Holst is, you know, removing a certain part of it, which would maybe reduce the administrative overhead and maybe have some budget implications. But I think, and I would encourage everyone around the table to be really specific about what it is you want to reduce or eliminate. Because this is about identifying areas to do that. You know, it's not like an information gathering exercise. We say, like, how many people work in this area, and like, what do they do? Right? Like, that's not what we're doing here. We're identifying areas to, and the budget process, especially the multi-year budget process, we're gonna get into every area and what they're doing, and what should their budget be higher or lower, and you can bring motions all throughout the budget process about how to change those things. And the sooner you do that, the better, I think, if you're interested in those kind of changes. So on the tree protection bylaw, I'm not gonna support adding it to the list because I don't want to eliminate it.
Thank you. I don't have anybody else on the list. I did put myself on the list. I just want to make a brief comment on this. I can just do that from the chair if colleagues are okay with that. I appreciate that this is a service reduction and elimination. I'm not going to support it because I don't think that the magnitude is there to make much of a difference, and I also think that changes can be made through the existing process that is outlined for this particular bylaw. I will say that I did not support the reduction to 50 centimeters. I like the 75. But that's a discussion I think that happens within the bylaw, not against it. So I'm not going to support this particular one being on the list. I think we need to look at things that have a bigger magnitude, and I don't think this is the place to look. I think the existing process can capture this. So, Councillor Van Holst, you wanted to add this to the list. There clearly is not consensus on this, so I would look for a seconder to add this one to the list. I think there were a couple of people who indicated support. I actually need a seconder to add this to the list? Councillor Lehman. Okay, I think we've had lots of discussion. Is everybody prepared to vote on this? Okay, so this one is ready. All right, we'll put that up on the screen.
Closing the vote, the motion is lost, 4-8.
Okay, that one's not on the list. Councillor Van Holst, yes?
Yes, thank you. I might have asked this before the vote, Mr. Budget Chair, but perhaps because this was declined, since it wasn't going to save enough money in terms of the number of councils' perspectives, perhaps you can tell us what level of savings we should be looking for in this meeting, and I'll know whether I should bring other ideas forward or not bring other ideas forward. Thanks.
Thank you for the question, Councillor. I was simply giving my own interpretation. I'm not going to give a number. I don't want to influence my colleagues. My comments were more about, I thought the process could capture it, and I can't recall the exact money that it cost to implement it, but I was looking for bigger things myself. Obviously, I appreciate the colleagues can bring any item forward of any magnitude, so. Okay, I will just note, I know Councillor Helmer made some comments about the purpose of this meeting. There is a specific motion that the matter of service reductions and eliminations for specific service areas be referred to this meeting, and he is very right. That is what we articulated as the purpose of this meeting. And so I think a couple of times you've heard today, specifics are great because again, our staff want to bring back all of the relevant information to the budget process so that we can make the decision. So the more specific you can be about what you're doing and trying to achieve, the better. But obviously there is always an opportunity to ask some questions of staff at the meeting. Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have heard the words sacred cow be used a couple of times tonight, and I suppose I may be taking a shot at another quote-unquote sacred cow here. But I would like to add a program and asset review of Storybook Gardens to the list. I think we have to really ask ourselves, with the changing demographics of the city, the changing cultural needs, recently having looked at the Parks and Rec master plan and hearing even in this report the demand for increased programs and services at our community centers. We have a couple of neighborhoods, Summerside and Hyde Park in particular, that are in need of community centers. The Parks and Recreation Department does not really have a budget line item for replacement of existing park equipment, and we are spending $1.6 million a year on maintaining this venue, which to me, I question when we have things like the Children's Museum, East Park, attractions all over the city that bring people to London, whether or not we're getting value for a dollar, whether or not we should be in the business of running a destination like this. So I'd like us to at least consider that. I know that people will have many fond memories and emotional attachments, but in this day and age, is it still a relevant service for us to be offering as a municipality?
Okay, and you're looking for information on the potential impacts of the elimination of the services, basically the program that we provide. Councillor Turner and then Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you. I appreciate where the councillor's coming from. I think the report demonstrates that I think the annual net cost is about $100,000. So I wouldn't consider that to be material in this context. And I think when we take a look at arenas or anything else like that, we spend significantly more in terms of operating costs. There's value added to this. It's a tourism entity. It's a recreation facility for Londoners. Even if we were to open the gates and just let people in, there would be some cost associated with maintaining that, and I think that would probably exceed what the net impact to our budget is. So I won't support this one.
Councillor Cassidy.
I agree with Councillor Turner. It's not a lot in the overall scheme of things. That doesn't mean we shouldn't look after even small amounts in the budget, but I think the benefits of this outweigh the costs, and I think that it is a regional destination. I grew up in Sarnia, and my parents brought us to Storybook Gardens, and I think that it still happens. I think that still happens as well. There are every school in the city, I believe. That's the trip for kids in junior kindergarten and senior kindergarten. I went 5 times with my 3 kids, and the last one in senior kindergarten, I put my foot down and said, I'm not going to Storybook Gardens again. But on a different note, Mr. Presiding Officer, I chose not to ask for a point of personal privilege, but I would ask through you that my colleagues please refrain from using the term sacred cow. It has cultural implications, and I personally find it offensive, and I can't imagine what other people watching might think.
Thank you, Councillor Cassidy. Mayor Holder.
Thank you, Chair. Perhaps on a slightly lighter note, I do miss Slippery the Seal, but I will tell you that when I look at the math on Storybook Gardens and the net cost impact is $118,000 versus the 1.6 million, I look at it from that standpoint. And as as an amenity where we frankly don't have nearly the kinds of amenities that I think we would like to have to draw more tourists to our city. I won't support it, but I do appreciate the intent that the councillor is considering trying to uncover every aquarium stone to see what might be there. But in this case here, I just think that the net impact on it, when I've reviewed it, wouldn't, because I think what we're trying to do is while, to Councillor Van Holst's point, what's the number? I'm not sure that I always know, but there's 2 things. It either has to be material or it has to be mission critical in terms of what we as a city look to do. And perhaps the third thing is it just something that we perhaps look at and say, you know, can we fine tune? But I think the fine tuning may come about in another way. So I'm looking at things as mission critical or what I might imagine is a significant number, and I can't put that actual hook to it either. But when I look at some of the very large items that we've got and wonder, not so much are we going to eliminate that service. That's why when I've heard a number of colleagues, what they've said is let's be as specific as we can. And Chair, that was the point you made. Let's be as specific as we can within a program. So with all respect, I won't support that particular review at this time.
Other comments? Okay, there's not consensus on this, so Councillor Lewis would like this added to the list. Is there a seconder to support him in adding this one to the list? Okay, seeing none, so that's not going to be on the list. We're back to generating ideas from colleagues. Who else would like a turn? Councillor Turner.
Thanks. I think it's been discussed by a couple of councillors previous, and I think Councillor Squire addressed it as well. Concept of the amount of subsidy that we provide to tourism. The hotel accommodation tax was recently implemented. It had the potential to double the budget that was provided to tourism. I think we would take a look at what the appropriate level of funding for tourism. I wouldn't suggest a net decrease to the previous funding levels, but I think we would take a look at what the appropriate increase associated with the hotel accommodation tax should be. So I think that has the potential to be in the range of between 500,000 to $2 million.
So if I understand correctly, Councillor Turner, tourism has a budget. They've received now a portion of the municipal accommodation tax. You are looking to not have them have the full amount of both of those, but you're looking for information on a budget level in between that would provide some savings. The municipality would keep the rest.
Yeah, if I may clarify, I think the 50% we're obligated to provide to tourism. It's a question of what the municipal levy contribution is to tourism in light of the new municipal accommodation tax contributions.
I hope if colleagues have questions about that, certainly we can get more clarification. So I'll have that open for discussion. Mayor Holder.
Start with a question to staff, if I can, with respect to the hotel tax. And I know that if you'll recall, colleagues, we went around this table and I thought we did a pretty good job of spending money that we didn't have a particular outline for at the time, but I think in good faith we made some commitments with respect to that. So my question to staff is, how far out are we allocated in terms of, this is my first question, if I might, through you, Chair, in terms of monies anticipated or actually received from the affectionately called hotel tax?
I'm going to go back to Councillor Turner because I think he's going to clarify the segment of the tax he's talking about, because there's the municipal component of which we have our process and have allocated, and then there's the tourism component. So Councillor Turner.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Specifically to that, I'm not talking about the municipal revenues associated with the municipal accommodation tax. I'm talking about what the levy contribution is and the component that is passed on to Tourism London. So nothing to do with how the city spends its portion of the municipal accommodation tax. It's the other side of it.
Well, I appreciate the councillor's comments. I really think it speaks to a broader issue in terms of marketing and what does Tourism London need. And frankly, this is something I don't know. So if this was a review for the purpose of trying to understand better the longer term needs, as opposed to what we might well be cutting or not, as the case may be in terms of their budget, that could be a fair discussion. But that's not what I understand the intent of this to be. So I can't support it from the standpoint of, when I look at what does a company need to succeed when it has business, when it's trying to grow its business, it needs marketing commitments. So I'm very mindful that if the intent would be just to take a broader review, I could support it. If the intent is to find ways that we can cut, it feels premature to me.
I want to just provide a little bit of information, and I want to go to our treasurer to provide some information too, just to keep the conversation on track, and I'm providing no opinion on this. We have a portion of our budget, which I'll ask our treasurer to outline, that we give to Tourism London from the tax levy. The municipal accommodation tax was created and 50% of it goes to Tourism London. Councillor Turner is suggesting that because they have an additional portion from the municipal accommodation tax, that we should review the portion from the levy for an appropriate size and scope. I think that begs two questions. What are the numbers that we're actually talking about for Tourism London? And two, can Tourism London use the municipal accommodation tax for their general operations so that we could actually reduce our portion of the municipal contribution to their budget, just to make sure we have all the information to have the debate?
So through the chair, approximately $3 million is what we're anticipating at this time on an annual basis with respect to the municipal accommodation tax. So 50% of that is placed into the Municipal Infrastructure Tourism Reserve Fund, and that is fully committed until the end 2021. So that has already gone forward. I'm just trying to double check that. There's, yeah, 2020 and 2021 was still available. So the remainder of the 50% goes to Tourism London. Their budget that is funded from the City of London is approximately $2 million. Most of that is staffing, but they do have some other line items that are purchase services that would be broader, that certainly tourism would need to speak exactly whether or not some of the funding that they're receiving through the municipal accommodation tax could potentially fund a portion of their purchase services. I think that's probably the only thing that there may be discretion on their end to possibly pay for, but we would need to speak with them to get further clarification.
So just so I'm clear, I think that's what Councillor Turner is asking for, the information back so that we could make that decision. I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'll go to Councillor Turner and then I'll continue with the list.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is worthy of investigation to figure out what the options are available to us. I'm not suggesting a reduction in the net transfer that goes to Tourism London from what the historic levels have been, but a question of what the incremental total transfer to Tourism London should be. So if that helps.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I have my list right. Mayor Holder spoke, Councillor Turner, Councillor Squire, and then Councillor Lewis, and then Councillor Van Holt.
I'll be happy to support what Councillor Turner is asking for, because it is going to involve a review of what we can and can't do. And I don't think certainly I'm not, and I don't think Councillor Turner is reaching a conclusion at this point in time about what we can do, but I think it's very worthy of looking at that, because people will be asking the question of them getting these two pots of money, and I think it's important that we be able to explain that what they can use each amount of money for. So I'm very supportive of this.
Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you to colleagues, I won't be supporting this. You know, we just had a discussion about one destination item in the city that we weren't prepared to even consider, and part of it was that it was a regional destination, and we need to market ourselves. I can tell you that some of what the municipal accommodation tax has been used for already by Tourism London, who has not allocated their full amount yet, unlike ourselves. Broader marketing of the air show, for example, to a wider audience, to bring in visitors from the US, and particularly marketing at other air shows to let those attending know that there's an air show in London. That's just one example of what they're using the hotel accommodation tax for. Tourism London has not allocated any funds from the accommodation tax to its core operations, and it's my understanding that that money is not in fact eligible to be applied that way. I don't know if staff can clarify that. I will put that out there perhaps for their comment afterwards, but the synergies that we're already seeing from Tourism London, colleagues, we already save quite a bit of money by having them use City Hall's payroll service. As an example, City Hall's HR. They don't have separate departments for those things. Those are done through the City of London. So if we truly, as the mayor indicated, marketing is important for the community, then when we're asking them to do bigger and better things, bring back the CMAs, let's think about the Junos again. Let's think about the World Junior Hockey Championships. If we want to market London and we want to go out and bring these things and the economic value that they bring to the city each and every year, and it's in the millions, I can tell you at our AGM for Tourism London, the occupancy rate in our hotels all year round now is getting close to 70%. That's up markedly from where we were just a couple of years ago. So I think if we want them to keep trending upward, that we have to not look at just keeping them where they've always been. The accommodation tax was not meant to replace the core operations, and so I can't support this.
Councillor Van Holst, then Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. I'll remind my colleagues that part of the reason we wanted Tourism London to have this money was so that they could bid on events without having to come back to council, because that would happen a number of times. They'd come and say, can we have some money to bid on this event or that event? And even that process, that cycle of getting permission from us hindered their ability to do that. So I'm very I'm hesitant. I'm not going to support this. I'll go as far as to say that. I'm very happy with how they're investing their money. I don't know that we could do a better job. So I prefer to just leave this and see that grow and then look at this at some other time.
Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. So I support what Councillor Turner is talking about, but he's being too general for me. I sort of chided a whole bunch of other people for not being very specific, and I'm going to do the same with Councillor Turner. I think we have to be very clear with what we're talking about and sort of what the range of reduction would be. And I think for when it comes to Tourism London, I would support a small, steady decrease, but not some big reduction. And so I think that we should be clear about that. What I would like to propose is that we reduce the property tax component of the budget by $25,000 a year, each year for 4 years. That would be a 5% reduction over that whole period, so it'd be $100,000 in year 4. It'd be small little chunks on the way down. I think it'd give them time to adapt. Their overall budget's gone up 75%, right, with the municipal accommodation tax. And yes, that money has to be used, the new money has to be used for exclusively promoting tourism. But before they had that money, they certainly were promoting tourism, right? I mean, they were spending some of their $2 million on that function before. And I think if we keep it small and we're clear with what the range of possibilities are, I think that's helpful for the organization, frankly, that they say, hey, council's looking at making a change. Well, what kind of change? Like, are we talking about 50% cut or, you know, so I think something small that's phased in over time, it takes a little bit of pressure off the property taxpayer. I think it's very reasonable. It still lets them do a lot more than they were able to do before because they're still dealing with a lot more money from promoting London. I think they are doing a good job. The question is, how should it be paid for? Right? And I think that this is an area where tourism should be paying for tourism. I think we can dial back the property tax support just a little bit, and it gives us a little bit more flexibility to pay for things that don't have any other source of funding, where only property taxes are going to be able to pay for that service. So I would propose that. I don't know if there's a seconder for that, but just to reduce it $25,000 a year. That's using 2019 as the base year and knock it down. Obviously, there's going to be inflation and things on top of that, but if we have that, and then the staff can report back about what the implications would be on that. If there's some implications I'm not aware of and it'd be a huge disaster, we can hear that at the time when we're dealing with the service reductions and eliminations report. So I would support that, but not the general one of just take a look at the whole thing and reducing it.
Mayor Holder.
Look, I think all of us, Chair, can be accused of moving into our own little fiefdoms and deciding what's important or not important. I come back to the original intention behind this, and that was to be able to allow Tourism London to have the flexibility to aggressively promote our city. I actually support fully what Councillor Lewis has said here. I will not support even that 5% reduction, because as modest as it sounds, it gets away, I think, from what the intention of having this fund was to begin with. And I think we can judge Tourism London on the merits of this. But this is about promoting London and drawing tourism, whether it's internal tourism or external tourism, as the case might be. We've had a number of examples where it's been done well. I do believe that the funding support that will come as a result of this newfound money, as it were, puts us in a very strong position. I hope that colleagues will not support the motion for this particular review, because it comes to the very heart of what matters to our city, and that's the ability to promote it.
Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Presiding Officer, and I'm happy to second Deputy Mayor Helmer's amendment. When we put forward the municipal accommodation tax, there was a lot of discussion about the base budget. There was never an overall consensus that this additional funding would go to Tourism London and the base budget would be left alone. This is almost a doubling of their budget. If you look at Tourism London as an economic development partner in the city, we have a number of economic development partners who have not had any kind of funding increases other than inflationary over the last 10 years. Do I think Tourism London is the most important economic development partner in the city? no, it's an important partner, for sure. But to see on almost doubling of their budget was never the intention when we implemented the municipal accommodations tax. That was never the intention. And in fact, there was a proposal from Tourism London that they would get the entire municipal accommodation tax, which would have been almost a tripling of their budget. And council said no to that. So there was always an intention to review the property tax levy supported portion of the budget. I think this is completely reasonable, a gradual reduction, and it's not a huge chunk of a reduction out of 2 million, if you consider 100,000 out of 2 million, it's not big. We have a lot of other priorities. Other councillors say that all the time. Our sources of revenue are finite, and we have to spread it across a huge swath of services that people rely on. And I think this is completely reasonable.
Councillor Turner?
Thank you. I appreciate what Councillor Helmer said. I think with this specifically, it's not as nuanced as trying to figure out what the operations are within a certain program area. It's a question of the level of transfer and funding. So current base funding, as Ms. Barbone had said, is about $2 million a year. I'm not contemplating that should be reduced in any way. I think $2 million is a fair operating fee. In fact, the success of Tourism London on that $2 million has been marked. All the things that Councillor Lewis talked about were achieved on $2 million a year. There's an additional $1.5 million per year that can go to Tourism London. The question is, what portion of that? At the end of the day, what should Tourism London's budget be? Should it be $3 million? Should it be $3.5 million? So that $2 million levy funding plus $1.5 million of municipal accommodations tax, what should it be? I think what Councillor Helmer discusses, I think it's appropriate to take a look at how we phase it in. I think it still needs to be a little larger. I didn't want to kind of bias the conversation with a dollar figure, but in my head that was around $500,000. So that at the end of it, tourism's budget would be $3 million. It would be $1.5 million in levy funding from the city and $1.5 million in funding from the municipal accommodations tax. At the end of it, the Tourism London's budget has increased by 50%. That's a lot. And it decreases the impact on taxpayers by $500,000 a year. So I think there's a number of ways to get there. I think if in the whole motion, something like a phasing in, as Councillor Helmer had addressed, of whatever that value be, I think that's what I'm trying to get towards. And I think knowing what the limitations of the transfer of the municipal accommodations tax are, what can be used for operational funding, what can't be, helps give us some clarity on what that end number can be in terms of what our potential for reduction in the levy contribution to tourism is.
Okay, I'm going to go to Councillor Lewis, and then what I'm going to do is suggest a process, since we have two differing opinions with seconders potentially on where to go. That doesn't mean we can't still debate. I just want to suggest a process, but you had your hand up before I thought of that, so go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad my hand was quicker than your brain on that one. Colleagues have pointed out that Tourism London's, we've done all of this on the $2 million that they have in base funding already. Well, in fact, they haven't. They've had to come cap in hand to this chamber asking for bid money for various and sundry things that they've brought to the city, which the accommodation tax now replaces. Now they can have that bid money available without having to come and ask for us. And when I hear Deputy Mayor Helmer say, it will free up money to spend on things that are other priorities, there absolutely are other priorities. But you know what Tourism London's success is doing is it's increasing our share, the 50% that this council and the city receives from the hotel accommodation tax as well. So their success increases our funding success for other things as well. This municipal accommodation tax has been in place for less than a year. And we are already talking about changing the rules of the game on Tourism London at this stage through a service review. We don't even have a year What are we reviewing on something that hasn't been in place for a year? You know, it's not $2 million that they've accomplished all of these things on. They've come to this council for many, many years asking for bid money for this and bid money for that, because they haven't been able to fund those things out of their core operating fund. So to say now we can start reducing that, I just think it's very, very much cart before the horse. So I just want colleagues to consider that. It's not $2 million flat. It's $2 million plus everything else they've had to come and ask for.
Okay, now I want to make a suggestion. There's enough support for looking at something to do with Tourism London that it seems like we're going to have a motion and decisions. There's two differing opinions. Councillor Turner raised the issue first, so I want to give him the first opportunity to make a motion. I know that there's potential other motions if there's disagreement on his. Again, this is just to add it to the list, but obviously being specific about what we're reviewing on the list is fine. So if Councillor Turner suggests something doesn't pass, doesn't mean something alternative can't be suggested, but I did want to give him the first opportunity to suggest a motion. I think at this time I'd like to do that and see if there's a seconder.
I guess the motion would look something along the lines of that staff report back on opportunities for phased levy reductions over the budget term, and report back as a result of the contribution, the increased contribution from the municipal accommodations tax.
Okay, is there a seconder for that? Councillor Squire, okay. So we can debate that, although I think there's a few colleagues who feel like they want to be pretty specific with numbers, so we can discuss this, we can vote on it, and then we can entertain other motions if it fails. If it passes, I think we'll get the information back, we can deal with it at budget time as well. So discussion on Councillor Turner's motion, seconded by Councillor Squire, to add it to the list in the way that Councillor Turner described. Councillor Pelosa.
Thank you, Mr. Presiding Officer. Wondering, as they are both in the same genre of concerns, if it'd be appropriate to have a point A and then a part B of a target of, is this appropriate of this number coming in? I'm trying to avoid two votes and just do one.
There's no reason why we can't ask for two different scenarios on the same item. So that's a fair suggestion. I think what I want to do is go to Councillor Helmer, and because what I don't want to do is suggest putting stuff together and then everybody wants it to separate. So I'll ask Councillor Helmer if he's supportive of the idea of asking for two scenarios, since given he wants to suggest the second one.
I've seen this movie before. This is where we spend more time talking about how to do it than doing it. And so I'd suggest we just have two different votes. People have different opinions. It's very clear on how they want to vote on these two issues.
So we'll have two motions because people don't want to do it that way. So, which is fine. So we have a draft for you, Councillor Turner. If you can review it and make sure you're okay. Councillor Squire, you were the seconder. Are you good with that language? Okay, so discussion on this, Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you very much, Mr. Budget Chair. I do like the reasonableness of the Deputy Mayor's suggestion. However, when this, if this review should take place, I would like to have a strong sense of how much this reduction investment would have an impact on London. Because you see, most businesses would say the more promotion you do, the more money you make. And for a $25,000 investment in promotion, if we were to bring in $1.25 million of more hotel use, that we would break even. So there's a very strong opportunity that we'll do better by putting more money in than worse. So I don't see this as a moral argument as how much should Tourism London get. I see this as a very practical argument of how much return can we get on our investment? And so that would be the piece of information I would definitely want to see in this. I believe that we will be in the black with these investments, so again, I'll probably vote against this, but should I lose? I hope we'll look at that and have some good data to tell us whether or not we should or should be investing more or less.
Counselor, I'm going to go to Ms. Barbone on this, but my understanding is that should we pass something like this, the Tourism London would very much want to provide some information about the impacts of this, and that this is about a process where we're making a suggestion, we're not making a decision, lots of information is going to come back, and that is going to include, my expectation is, information from Tourism London about their activities and the impacts and that sort of thing. Ms. Barbone, could you confirm that that is the type of process that would be engaged should we pass something like this, and that is the type of stuff that would come back to us, just so we're clear on what information we're going to get?
Thank you, through the chair. So our intent would be that we would collect all the information, provide back summaries of where we're going, what we have, and connect with tourism as well, and to be able to give you a fulsome picture so that you could make an informed decision on whether you wanted to move towards any iteration of what you've been discussing this evening.
And of course, there would obviously be all of the public engagement components of the budget process that are available for everything that we're talking about tonight, even though we've made no decisions on them, that we've just flagged them for information back.
Through the chair, so if we include it through the budget, we would have budget engagement. If you would wish to have a report back sooner to identify whether you wish to refer to the budget, you could include an intermediary step as well.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Mr. Mayor.
Thanks very much. I think we're getting trapped in our own dialogue here, and it was the caution that you threw out at the very beginning, Chair, and that is that on the one hand, give us an opportunity to present some ideas to staff on issues that we'd like to review. Now we're getting quite prescriptive as to result. And I thought that's what the process was intended to advise us. And as soon as we get prescriptive to the result, we're in fact doing your work for you. And as much as I'm sure you would like us to do that in some respects, that wasn't how you laid out, as I thought, what this was about. And I'd caution our colleagues, if we've got a general comment in an area, but we're debating the merits either to, I won't impugn motive, I would never do that. But in terms of, I don't think we should be debating this here as much as when you said context, I thought was to give a brief reference. But I'm hearing a full-blown bloody debate, and I'm just trying to understand. If that's the intent of this, then let's get into it now, and we can run through it. But I thought we had a process by which we were going to deal with this. So Chair, I'm going to throw it back to you and ask you to caution us to be mindful, if I may, as opposed to being so prescriptive with staff.
Sure.
Your thoughts.
I'll reiterate what I said before. I appreciate the opportunity to do so. There's obviously going to be a fine line here when we're not making a decision yet between colleagues who want to include something on the list and colleagues who do not. And they're going to provide some context and justifications for that is going to move into debate on the issue to a certain degree to prove their points. I'm asking us to try to limit that as much as possible and still make your point, because we will have the opportunity for the debate with the information, with public engagement down the road. But I recognize that we're adding things to a list, and people will at some point realize that staff cannot do all of this. And so the amount of things on the list is important, and people need to have the opportunity to be able to articulate why they do not want something on the list. And we'll have that opportunity at the end of this process, but it'll be very difficult from a chairing perspective to limit colleagues too much. So it's kind of in your hands on how far you want to go with your discussion, knowing that if these things pass, there's going to be lots of opportunity for debate on them in a lot of detail with more information. But again, I respect everybody's need to make their points about why something should or shouldn't be on the list. So I know that was probably what I said before, but that's my reminder. That is all that I have on the speakers list for the motion moved by Councillor Turner, seconded by Councillor Squire, which is on our screen, which is opportunities for This is what's being added to our list for consideration. Opportunities for a phased-in Tourism London funding reduction from the municipal levy in light of the new funding transferred from Tourism London by the municipal accommodation tax. That's what we're considering. I see no other speakers, except for Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you. Our treasurer's comment on an informed decision was enough to have me change my mind, so I'll support this.
Okay, if there are no others, I'll open this one for voting.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed, 8-4.
Okay, so that's on the list. We are scheduled to take a break at 6:30. That's 12 minutes from now. Perhaps someone's suggesting something next that might be short. If no one has an idea, I'm going to give up the chair because I actually have an idea to suggest. So I will hand the chair over to Councillor Lehman because he's closest. You're going to chair the meeting while I make a suggestion.
Councillor Morgan.
So what I would like to suggest is I would like us to take a look at, and then I'll articulate the motion a little clearer, but I want colleagues' feedback on this. A look at some of the contributions we make to some of our reserve funds and when we can potentially roll those back. And I'm not suggesting that we don't make adequate contributions to reserve funds, but there are some areas where we're contributing for a specific reason that may not be necessary anymore. I'll give you one example. In the, I believe it's the, I can't remember if it's the Economic Development Reserve Fund or the Triple E Fund, but the treasurer will correct me. We removed a piece of capital from it to support implementing an LED lights program on the streets, and then the results of the savings from that program are going in to pay back the capital in that program. At some point, that will be completely repaid, and then there will be no need for that contribution potentially anymore because it was created through the capital investment. One of the ways that we can actually reduce the budget is to take a look at stopping paying back part of those things, or at least check the levels that we're at and decide whether those levels are sufficient. We can also modify the amount that's flowing into that fund. I may not support that in the end, but it is one that I don't mind getting more information back about on specific reserve funds where contributions are being made because of specific actions that we're taking and are being repaid back over time. I know we have an analysis of our reserve funds going on, but I think that this particular one is one in the budget process that we could take a look at if you want to look at savings for consideration, because that contribution on an annual basis could be rolled into the tax base or rolled into another reserve fund, but it could be available. If there's another phase of the program that is contemplated, that's information we can get so we know the consequences of it. But so I would like our staff to take a review of the reserve funds to look for contributions that we could potentially reduce based on scenarios where they're going to potentially be reduced anyways in the long run.
Does staff want to comment on that?
Through the chair, so the contributions, the savings that you are referring to for some of the LED lights specifically was out of our Triple E, that the savings then get contributed back to that. So that is done outside, but we can certainly include that in an analysis as well of what all the contributions are to reserve funds and fulsome in light of the commitments that are also with those reserve funds as a whole. So that is something we could certainly bring back to Council and Committee to review.
Councillor Morgan, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I want to be very clear. I have no intention of supporting irresponsible reduction to reserve fund contributions, but in cases like this particular one, where we have some reserve funds with uncommitted balances that have inflows into them that are created in this way, this may be the only one. I just I haven't done my own analysis of all of them. It's an area for consideration. Again, I would decide my support on that at the time that I got the information back, but people want suggestions on where we could save money. This is one that I came up with in my review of looking at things that may have a minimal impact, but we won't know that till we get the review back.
Do staff want to comment?
Through the chair, absolutely. We'll provide that information, and you can do a fulsome analysis of what Triple E is actually a reserve, but we can show there isn't money that's regularly going into. That is through the personnel savings that we have that get allocated there, but we can certainly bring that information forward so you can see what that is and how that might be utilized.
Any other comments? Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. Through the chair, I wonder if Councillor Morgan could just clarify. He said quite a lot of words, and I just want to make sure I understand exactly what his meaning is. Are you talking about a review of all of the reserve funds and reserves, or just this one kind? Like Tripoli is a specific kind of reserve. I'm not necessarily against taking a look at that one, but there are other ones where I'd have major problems, like capital infrastructure, gap reserve fund, for example.
Councillor Morgan.
I want no review of any reserve fund that doesn't have uncommitted balances or sufficient balances in them for our current commitments. So I see no value in looking at reducing contributions to reserve funds where we're behind on where the contributions need to be. So there are a couple like economic development and Triple E that have uncommitted balances in them. Those would be the ones that I would look at the inflows into, and then we would have a discussion about our long-term plans for those. I believe having an uncommitted balance is not necessarily a bad thing because it creates opportunities, but I also know that there are some inflows that we could take a look at for potential adjustment. Again, the adjustments and what I would suspect us to do, I wouldn't render judgment on that until I saw it. But I don't want to look at all of the reserve funds. I only want to look at the ones with uncommitted balances, because those are the ones that I think are the most appropriate to look at. I don't want to look at things that we may need to be boosting.
Any other comments? Councillor Morgan, we have a motion prepared. Can you read it and see if that's what you were indicating?
Yeah, that's close. I'm not sure the last part is really necessary. After tax levy. I mean, the rest of it can be decided based on what the information is. Yeah, you can put a period after scaled back, but that may not be the result of the decision, so.
Councillor Helmer. Councillor Helmer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just while working on the language, I wanted to, I've just been thinking about what Councillor Morgan has been suggesting. There are four kind of broad categories of reserve funds, and for my own comfort, I'm thinking about ways to exclude whole classes of them so I don't have to worry about them coming back in a report. The four are capital asset renewal and replacement. Those are the ones I'm really concerned about including, there's capital asset growth, which I'm also a bit concerned about. The special projects and new initiatives, which is the category that includes the things Councillor Morgan has mentioned so far, and then contingency, stabilization, risk management. The last two are really big, frankly. The other two, I think, are in a totally different kind of category. And I would be more comfortable excluding the capital asset renewal and replacement and the capital asset growth. The capital asset growth is not very big right now anyway. The special projects and new initiatives, the contingencies, stabilization, risk management, I'd be okay with looking at those, especially the uncommitted balances part that you mentioned earlier. But I think if it's as broad as what you initially suggested, I wouldn't be able to support it. So I just raise it for you to consider.
Councillor Morgan.
This is why Councillor Helmer and I sit on corporate services together, because we tend to make things better when we work together. I agree with what you've said, and I'm comfortable adding that clarification into the motion.
Are you good with that motion, Councillor Morgan?
That looks like what would accommodate Councillor Helmer's concerns. I don't know if he's had a look at it too, but I would, I think this one is a team approach, so I'm looking for his guidance as well.
Councillor Helmer.
That's good.
Okay, it appears we have a motion that's ready to be seconded. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Helmer, second it, and we will call the vote. Oh, I guess we have discussion first, right? First time. Any discussion on this motion? Any more discussion? I see none, so we will call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion is passed 12-0.
I just want to know for colleagues that I did something that was exactly 12 minutes long, and that brings us exactly to 6:30, which is the scheduled time for our break. So I'd look for a motion to recess for 30 minutes. Moved by Councillor Pelosi, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. We can hand vote this. All those in favor? All right, that carries. We're recessed. Okay, we're back. We have quorum. Where we left off was, I have no speakers list, and we were still generating ideas, so we might be done. There might be more ideas. Maybe Councillor Pelosi would like to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Presiding Officer, and you're not done. That was just wishful thinking. Question through you to staff in regards to a section in the finance as per page 109, 145, and 121. In regards to our finance of payroll services, I'm seeing in here that it's saying that payroll operating costs as per direct deposit and check is the third highest of all 16 municipalities that was looked at. And as per accounts payable operating cost per invoices processed is the fourth highest as per all 16 municipalities. Looking to see what's causing some of these numbers, and then I'll have a follow-up question.
Just give our staff a minute to flip to the pages you're referring to. Go ahead.
Through the chair, I heard the payroll one, but I'm sorry, I missed the other one that you referred to.
Accounts payable on page 121.
So through the chair, specifically with respect to the payroll one, so these, I don't have my notes in front of me, but I know we did review this specifically when the MB&C report was brought forward. The payroll we're currently looking at right now and trying to address that through some automation that we're looking at currently, and to combine a couple of systems that are currently moving forward that were approved through the, working through the budgets and those pieces. The accounts payable specifically, I cannot recall, I'm sorry, off the top of my head, what that specific response was to that. I know it's something that we were looking at with respect to earlier in the year when we did present those measures. I just can't recall what that is off the top of my head. I can report that out separately to provide that information.
Thank you. I appreciate the follow-up for accounts payable. And in regards to the payroll being the third highest, I'm wondering if part of those numbers are reflecting, is the city running other people's payrolls and it's kind of maybe skewing those numbers compared to what other municipalities might do? We've been, in my opinion, really great in other sections. So just when I start seeing the third highest, I was a little bit concerned.
Through the chair. So currently, right now, we have a couple of different divisions that contribute towards that. So we do, as a city, do some of the boards and commissions payroll as well. That is part of that. So there is a little bit there where and they had raised that even with tourism, where that work is all done centrally. There is some alignment of duties that we're currently looking at right now. So we're looking at how we can mitigate that through some automation and some things going forward with that. So yes, doing some of the boards and commissions and some of that other payroll. There is some economies of scale, obviously, by having that there, but there is some work that we do need to do with our system in that regard going forward.
Follow-up, well, thank you for that. And it was just a standalone question in regards to dearness, which is discussed on page 132. It was just an overall question of when we're looking at where we're following in at standard levels. I'm wondering if anyone knows if the KPMG report took into consideration the wait list that we have, if that would affect our service level in those areas, or if it was not even considered.
I see Ms. Datersbear in the back.
Through the chair, just to be clear again, the question was whether or not KPMG took into consideration the wait list we have. I'm not aware of that. I can certainly ask for more information, but I can follow up to get more information on that.
Okay, Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you. I was actually looking at that same area for maybe another line of reasoning. We're of course looking at reducing services here. However, there may be the possibility that there's economy of scales if we increase them. So my question to staff then is, would something like that apply to the Dearness Home in terms of long-term care? And it was the potential of creating some kind of a residence on that property, but we spend almost 23 million, and we get back 18 for a net cost of 5 million. If we actually had more long-term care service, would we reduce that 5 million to a lesser amount?
Ms. Dieters-Bear.
Through the chair, thank you for the question. We are required under the Long-Term Care Homes Act to provide long-term care services. So that's a mandatory service because we're a single-tier municipality. Your question about economies of scale, could we add residents and then reduce the costs? That would be something we'd have to look into. There are incremental costs as we increase the number of residents, and given the acuity levels of our residents, those costs continue to go up on a yearly basis. We're lucky that the city puts the money that it does into the home to provide good care, and we hope we can continue to have it that way. That being said, we can certainly explore it as well.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Pelosa.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. Just, I guess a follow-up for myself with Councillor Van Holst's thoughts on that. Was he trying to get to putting more residents into the facility we already have, or looking at a new build on the lot that we already own to increase residences and maybe distribute administrative capacity?
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you. I think I was thinking more of adding another residence. I don't know if there's more room for people in here. I would assume that we're making the best use we can of the space.
Okay, good. Great. Any other ideas that people would like to add with the list? If not, we could certainly, I could check in with the Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that there's a very important one that I hope colleagues will consider. And when I looked through the report, there's a grouping under transportation services. It's also under social services in regard to the subsidies that we provide. And that's one of the biggest issues that was talked about by members of this council during the campaign and since, and it continues to be a concern for our residents. And that's our transit service delivery. And I think that, when we look at, as I mentioned, the subsidized transit is listed in the grouping of social services. We've got the transportation services. We have these different subsidies that we're providing. So I think that an organizational review, and it may even require a deep dive, but I think a review of how we deliver transit services, and I don't know whether this will result in savings or changes of service or not, but I think getting a comprehensive plan on transit is important, and I think that by doing an organizational review, we might see that there are opportunities to free up funding that frankly is needed for better transit delivery in the city. So I'd like to propose that we have an organizational review of London Transit.
Okay, that sounds like a big one. So I'm wondering, are you suggesting that this be like a KPMG review? Because we've done some big service reviews on different areas, but they've been contracted out. They take a period of time. I just want to understand what you mean by a big review, so colleagues know what you're talking about.
I think that's the scope and scale that we've seen, as is happening with housing right now, is exactly the kind of proposal that I'm putting forward. And I realize that that may not come back in time to even reflect itself in the multi-year budget cycle right now. But I think by asking staff to start the work on this, we start the opportunity to look at how we're delivering transit in the city, how that relates to council's budget as well as the LTC's budget. I mean, obviously they have revenue that comes in from fares and everything else. It's not all our budget, but I think that starting to have that review process undertaken could potentially show some real value to us.
Okay, I'm going to ask our staff if they can comment on basically how that would work and whether we have, I assume we have some jurisdiction over doing a review of a outside board and commission, but I'm not 100% sure. I just want to make sure the councillor has the information before we discuss it, because I don't want to discuss something that might have some barriers or that we need information on. So first is this the type of thing that we could do with our KPMG reviews? And second, would we have jurisdiction to do it, or would we have to get more information back on how?
Mr. Chairman, the Transit Commission is a corporate entity that manages its own affairs, and it's our agent for the purpose of providing transportation. And I mean, that is a very long-standing relationship. Can we re-examine the way that transit is provided to Londoners? Yes, as a city, we're entitled to look at whether or not that's the most efficient way of dealing with it. And could we have somebody like KPMG do this? I think likely we could, yes. But I mean, that isn't going to have any direct impact on London Transit and their long-term contractual relationship with us. It is a very complicated structure, and it's certainly not something that we could do with a short turnaround. But it's something that we can look at over a period of years if council sees fit. One other thing I should say is that we're looking at London Transit as our service delivery partner for Rapid Transit as well, and that will open the door to further negotiations with them. And we depend on them to provide the connections to the Rapid Transit service. And so, again, there are things that will be changing over the next few years, and it will give council an opportunity to see whether or not we call it the last mile service, for example, whether or not London Transit is the best provider for those kinds of things. So there will be issues. We can look at it, but certainly not in the short term.
I have Councillor Helmer on the speaker's list.
Thank you. Through the chair to Councillor Lewis. I just want to clarify, was what he's suggesting a service reduction for transit or elimination of transit? Because that's what we're here today to discuss, and I just wanted to see if that's what he is indeed suggesting.
Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, for the question. I'm not sure that I'm suggesting a reduction in service. What I'm really trying to dig at here is, are there efficiencies to be found in our partnership with London Transit right now? And I'll point specifically to the example that is in my mind. We've had, through the last council, a subsidy brought in place to pay for free rides for kids under 12. And we've had another effort brought in to provide discounted passes for secondary students, and another one for low-income wage earners. So we keep piecemeal adding to what we're asking London Transit to do, and then we have to keep finding funding to add in addition to the funding that we provide them already to deliver those services. And I'm wondering if this piecemeal approach to transit service delivery is really is the most efficient way to do this, or do we have to look at how we're funding London Transit and let them decide what the delivery model is for students, let them decide what the delivery model is for low income earners, because we keep adding piece by piece to this, and I don't think that that's providing us the most efficient way to deliver good transit to Londoners. I think a comprehensive review might help us formulate a plan to do better with that, not to reduce transit, but to actually find ways so that we're doing less bureaucratically so that they can deliver better transit on the front lines.
Ms. Livingston.
Mr. Chair, I just wish to let council know that that very issue is a subject of discussion with LTC right now as we work through the multi-year budget process. Part of what we're all looking at is we have 5 separate programs. Is there a better integrated model? And we were intending on bringing forward that as part of the multi-year budget process this year.
So it sounds like that piece is going to be taken care of. I think some larger organizational structural review of transit really isn't a budget thing. That's more of a Civic Works big discussion on that sort of service delivery, so.
Yeah, if you'll indulge me, Chair, with that update from Ms. Livingston, I'm actually satisfied that, in fact, the goal that I'm immediately looking for is being worked towards. And once that's in place, then we can, other discussions can happen around what transit looks like in the future. But that immediate goal is an important one, and I'm glad to hear that's being worked on.
Okay, so sounds like we're good. I know other people stuck up their hand, but if it was related to that, that's not really on the table. So I'll kind of reset the speakers list back to ideas. And at some point, I want to check in with the treasurer, because I did say we're kind of adding to a list, so we can kind of check in and say, how does this list look from a workload perspective? I think that's probably appropriate, because as we add more things, eventually we're going to have to start to prioritize. And I just wanted, maybe I can check in where we are now, and then I'll go back to the speakers list. So I'll ask the treasurer, from the items that we've added to the list, even though we still have to have a vote on actually kind of approving the list, how does that look from a workload perspective in time for the multi-year budget deliberations?
So through the chair, most of these, I believe, we would be able to provide and do a report prior to the introduction of our multi-year budget. The only one that possibly may take a little bit longer is the Tourism London review, just in terms of collecting that information. But certainly that is something that we would endeavor to try to do. So I would say, based on what we have here, we'll be extremely busy this fall trying to pull this stuff together to bring forward. And if we have any more, we'll be looking to push a few out so that we can focus on delivering something prior to the MYB.
Okay, that seemed like good timing. So that's kind of where we stand now, but I'll go to Councillor Van Holst, and then I'll look for, then Councillor Turner will be next with an idea.
Thank you. I realize we're doing a housing review. However, I'll look at the homeless prevention section on the page. So it's about a $14.5 million expense. We're receiving $12 million, probably from the province, with a $2.3 million net budget item. And I know that it's certainly much more costly to put people in shelters than it is to have them housed. And I'm wondering if there's a way we can save there.
Councillor, with the greatest respect, if we have an idea and we want to bring back information, we have to start getting specific about it, because I don't want this to change into looking at the budgets and asking staff if there's a way to save money somewhere. I think our expectation is that through our regular service review process, they're looking for ways to save money all the time, and we're cycling through. So if you're looking for something specific in this space that you want looked at, I think that would be helpful, rather than the general, could we save money in the space question.
Okay, well, thank you. I can work at something more specific for that later. I'd like to go to the energy conservation line here, where we spent $154,000 on energy conservation. There was a return about 50. There's a number, 105,000 left. So I'm afraid I need some clarification from staff. Is this line telling me that we're getting there's a 3-year payback on the energy conservation that we do, or are we somehow constantly losing money on attempting to do energy conservation? Because if that's the case, this doesn't look like it's a worthwhile project.
Okay, I'm going to look to staff. Do you need specific page numbers from the counselor on this, or do you see where we are?
I'm just looking at page 26. It's under corporate additional and council services.
Just one sec.
Thank you, through the chair. This is the staff that run our programs that are related to energy. So that's all that is contained within that unit.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Councillor Turner.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Hopefully it just can be really brief. Not so much for debate, more as a suggestion. There are a number of areas where the province has assigned some regulatory constraints in terms of processing times and things like that. In some cases, we're compliant with those. In some cases, we're not. And in those cases where we're not, there's often, I guess it's the regulation, but there's really not much action that's brought forward as a result of not meeting those. I think something like building permits, for example. Not to say that that's the realm to go into, but there may be, given the fact that the province is downloading a significant amount of cost and undertakings that we're going to have to respond to, are there areas where we have to meet a provincial obligation that doesn't provide an impact to service delivery to specifically to residents, that we might be able to extend out those times? Or there's services that are discretionary that we provide for the province that we might want to exit from or perhaps charge back on. And I know this isn't very specific, and that's why I'm not raising it as a motion or anything like that, but there may be service delivery opportunities to look at in there because the province has put burden on us. I'd like to see some of the burden shifted back towards the province to try and equalize a little bit.
I'm not sure how you want to handle that one, but that might be, that one could be a possibly more information coming back later item, but I'll let staff respond.
Yeah, if I may, it's more philosophical, like what could we conceive of possibly, but as I said, as I looked through the report, I couldn't identify anything that lived within that realm, but there may be something that's outside of the report for us to identify.
Go ahead.
So through the chair, at a broad level, one of the things is the basic premise of not taking on things that the province may have prescribed if there isn't funding to go with it. Certainly at a basic philosophical level, we wouldn't want to take anything further on, but I think at a broad level, I mean, certainly Bill 108 does have some items that with tighter timelines and more prescription, that is part of that. Whether we have the opportunity as we're looking through that to even not follow through is still questionable at this point. But I think as we're looking at all of the provincial changes and through our service levels, we can keep that lens when we're reviewing our budget submissions as well. As if there's anything, that may be the simple way, I think, to address it, is that from a service level perspective, as we're doing budgets, we'll just keep a close eye on that, and certainly as the legislation is changing, to see if there is any opportunities. Bill 108 is the one thing that does come to mind, that there is changes that are coming, but we're monitoring those closely and are in process of trying to provide feedback to the government. So those are regulations still in play. There might be a number of other things that still haven't been decided yet, but we can certainly look for those on a broad level.
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you. I think that would be entirely appropriate. I think as you go through those, the opportunity to report to us to say what would implications be of non-compliance in certain areas, and ultimately as the board, we would have to absorb those risks of non-compliance if that's what, but I think it'd be helpful to know what those risks were and what the opportunity costs were associated with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Colleagues, just to help with where we stand, I did ask the clerk to put up kind of what we have on the screen. So if you click current item, you'll see as number 1, so our main motion, it has added in kind of the list of things that we've considered along with the communications pieces that were received. Certainly, we can still add to this, but I just, for anybody wanting to keep track of kind of what we've added to the list, I've made sure it's on the screen for you as we continue along. Are there further points of discussion? If not, then we have a list here. If people are comfortable with the list, we could have a mover and a seconder for the motion as it stands before you. Okay. Councillor Van Holst. Oh, you're willing to move it. Great. Councillor Van Holst is willing to move the list as it stands. Councillor Turner is willing to second. We'll have discussion on the list. So the list, as it stands, actually, I'll probably read this out just because we've done a lot of work and people at home might not be able to see. That on the recommendation of the city manager with concurrence of the managing director, corporate services, city treasurer, chief financial officer, the following actions be taken with respect to the review of city services for potential reductions and eliminations. Basically, A is the staff report be received. B, the following specific areas be considered for further review and potential service reductions and eliminations. One, downtown and industrial CIPs, using a reduced, basically reducing the level of subsidy. 2, information technology with a report back of past initiatives and potential future new tools. Section 3, opportunities for a phased-in Tourism London funding reduction from municipal levy in light of the new funding transferred to Tourism London from the municipal accommodation tax. 4, review of the reserve funds with uncommitted balances excluding the capital asset renewal replacement funds and the capital asset growth funds for an analysis of funding contributions to those funds where the annual contributions from the tax levies can be scaled back, and then receiving the communications. So that's the motion that we have. Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask that we call item 3 separately, the phased-in reduction of Tourism London. I think we've just heard from our staff that's going to take a little bit longer yet. And, you know, honestly, we've also got an interim GM at Tourism London who's just assumed her role. So we're asking someone who's taken on an interim role there to now help us with a service review on a municipal accommodation tax that's less than a year old. So I think with those factors in mind, I still cannot support 3, so I'd like that called separately.
So there's no problem calling that separately. Before I articulated the process as adding to the list, people could, you know, vote on the final list at the time. So I think I'll stay true to that and say that that one can certainly be dealt with separately. And we're going to just adjust the wording on this as well. First off, before we get this prepared, does anybody else want anything else voted on separately? Or before I get it up, Councillor Elmer?
Why don't you just pull them all separately and it'll make it very easy. There's only a few.
Okay, so yes, we will set that up. So the way this is going to look is, just so we don't have to type everything out again, you see the items before you, we're going to vote on, it's going to say approve Part A, it's going to approve Part B, Section 1, approve Part B, Section 2, so people know. I will remind you what parts we're voting on, but that way we don't have to retype them all. That is the motion. We're just approving them as separate. It'll come to council as a consolidated item. Yes, that will be faster too, just so everybody knows. So I need a mover and a seconder for Part A, which is basically receive the staff report. Moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Mayor Holder. We'll bring that up on the screen for voting if there's no discussion. Great.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 12-0.
Okay, the next will be B1, which is, so the B intro is that these things be considered in capitals for further review and potential service reduction and elimination. So I'll remind you, we're not approving these, we're simply bringing them back for information as part of the budget process. So part 1 is the downtown industrial CIPs item. I'll need a mover and a seconder for that piece. Moved by Councilor Lewis, seconded by Councilor Cassidy. Any discussion on that? Okay, we'll open B1 for voting.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 12-0.
Okay, B2 is the information technology piece with the report back of past initiatives and future potential review tools. Mover, Councillor Squire, seconder, Councillor Lehman. Any discussion? Okay, we'll open that for voting when it's ready. And if you get an error, just because there's a lot of motions loaded, you can just click OK. It's still taking your vote.
Closing the vote, the motion is passed 7-5.
Okay, item B3 is the opportunities for a phase-in of Tourism London funding reduction from the municipal levy in light of the new funding from the municipal accommodation tax. I need a mover and a seconder for that one. Councillor Turner, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. Any discussion? Okay, we'll open that for voting.
Closing the vote, the motion is passed 8-4.
Okay, B4 is the review of the reserve funds with uncommitted balances with the specific exclusions from the capital asset and capital growth funds. I need a mover and a seconder for that. Councillor Pelosa, Councillor Hillier. Any discussion? Okay, we'll open B4 for voting.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 12-0.
And the next one will be the balance of the clause, which is essentially it being noted relating to the communication pieces received on the added agendas. A mover for that, Councillor Pelosa, Councillor Turner, seconder. No discussion? Nope. I'll open that for voting too.
Closing the vote, the motion is passed 12-0.
Okay, so that deals with item 4.1, which is the portion. I'll just say at the conclusion of that item, I want to specifically thank our staff. This was a very comprehensive report pulled together at council's request, which I think is a very valuable tool with profiles of all the service areas leading into the budget process, not just for us, but anybody who accesses the agendas online and wants to look at it. I appreciate, and certainly I think I speak for everybody, we appreciate the work that was required to bring this before us so that we could make the decisions and identify the items that we did today. So thank you very much for the work you've done. Okay, Okay, the mayor's asked me just to get us to the in-camera piece, but before we do that, we need to identify the results of the London Convention Center vote and then move a motion to make the appointment. So I believe we're going to put the results of the vote on the screen, and I'll allow the clerks to identify the winner.
Thank you through the chair. Based on the ballot that was provided, Councillor Lehman received 7 votes and Councillor Turner received 4. So the appointment would be for Councillor Lehman.
Okay, so we need a mover and a seconder for that particular appointment. Councillor Hillier, seconded by Councillor Turner. Any discussion? Okay, we'll open that for voting as soon as it's ready.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 12-0.
So the only item left on the agenda is our confidential session. The reason is on the regular agenda, so it doesn't need to be read out. I'll look for a motion to move into confidential session. Councillor Pelosa, Councillor Hillier, any discussion? Okay, we'll open that for voting, and then we're moving to committee room 3. Committee room 3. There's nothing else on the agenda, so I would expect that we would open the doors and adjourn from there.
Councillor Hillier? Closing the vote, the motion's passed 12-0.